Chapter I. Of Mademoiselle Ixe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by David Wales. Mademoiselle Ixe by Lanoe Falconer. "I expect her every minute," said Mrs. Merrington. "The train arrives at 3:30. "I hope she will be a success," said Mrs. Barnes, the vicar's wife. "Oh, I hope so indeed. We have been so unfortunate lately. Miss West I really liked, such a ladylike person. Her touch on the piano was lovely, and her French quite Parisian, but she did not spell very correctly, and she knew nothing of arithmetic, and so much is expected in that way nowadays. The Fräulein knew everything. It was quite wonderful, but then her manners were very strange, and Mr. Merrington said it made him feel ill to lunch with a person who never washed her hands, and certainly she was very dirty. Miss Olivier was everything one could wish for as far as teaching went, and Evelyn improved under her very much, but she had very peculiar views, and indeed went as far as ladies' rights. So, of course, I was not sorry when she left. And as for Miss Bond, she was unsatisfactory in many ways." The last phrase was, as it sounded, the outcome of a second thought. Mrs. Merrington had been about to say, "So terribly High Church," but, with a timely recollection of the views of her listener, suddenly altered her mind and her conclusion. "Where did you hear of this one?" "My sister, Lady Carline, you know, recommended her. When they were in Florence she used to give French and music lessons to my niece. She came to England only a week ago to try and find a situation in an English family, and saw my advertisement was it not strange? And remembered that I was a sister of Lady Carline's, and so she called upon my sister and begged her to recommend her to me. She seems just what I want, a first-rate pianist, and knows several languages and Latin, enough to ground Freddie. So thoroughly accustomed, too, to English ways, which is a great comfort, as she had so many English pupils in Florence." "I suppose she is an Italian?" "No, I don't think she is an Italian exactly. I am not quite sure what she is. Her name, rather peculiar, is Ixe." "Ixe, did you say?" "Yes, it is spelt I-X-E. Evelyn says it should be pronounced Ixe, like Eeks in weeks, but we don't know whether it is a French or a German name." "At any rate, she is a foreigner." "Oh, yes." "A Roman Catholic?" "Oh, no, oh, dear, no. The great objection to foreign governesses, in my opinion, is that they are always either Roman Catholics or nothing." Mrs. Merrington gave a little cry of dismay, but, recovering herself, said, "But that cannot be the case with Mademoiselle Ixe, for my sister is very particular, most particular in that way. On the contrary, I remember now, poor thing, she has had a great deal of trouble about her religion, for she is separated from her family on account of her views." "I suppose you mean she has changed her religion?" "Yes, that is what I understand. My sister said, 'Evelyn, what did your aunt say about Mademoiselle Ixe's religious opinions?'" The young girl thus appealed to sat a little way behind Mrs. Merrington, and was engaged in what appeared to be an acrimonious discussion with the young man beside her. To him she now said sharply, "Please do hold your tongue for one moment, Perry. I cannot hear what mamma is saying." And then, turning to her mother, answered, "I forget. Oh, yes, now I remember. Something about her detesting anything like Romanism as much as Aunt Charlotte did." "I did not mean that," said Mrs. Merrington hastily, observing a shade on Mrs. Barnes' face, "but about Mademoiselle Ixe and her family. I think the letter is here somewhere. Oh, yes, this is it." She read aloud, "The poor soul has been separated from her relations by serious difference of opinion for some years. It is a painful subject with her, and I advise you not to allude to it." Exclaimed Mrs. Barnes, in so unpleasantly significant a tone that Mrs. Merrington was glad to change the subject. "My dear," she said, addressing some one hidden behind an outspread sheet of the Times, "ought not the carriage to have been back from the station by this time?" The question had to be repeated before the paper was lowered and Mr. Merrington's weather-beaten, grey-whiskered face disclosed. "Certainly not," was his answer. "If Giles brings the horses quietly along, as he ought to. Carchester Junction is a mile beyond Carchester town. That makes 10 miles and a half good from here." 10 miles and a half," repeated the young man who was seated beside Evelyn. "Not quite so far as that, is it, Mr. Merrington?" But this ancient dispute was suspended for the moment by the sound of a ring at the front door. "There she is!" exclaimed Mrs. Merrington, and went out into the hall to greet the newcomer. The others listened with great interest to the bustle of the arrival. "I do hope she will not be dull," said Evelyn in a low voice to Parry. "Why should she be dull?" "Because every one is in this neighbourhood. Hush! Here she comes." There are those who at first sight impress us not at all. There are those who impress us most distinctly. Mademoiselle Ixe evidently belonged to the latter class, and it was the more singular as nothing could have been less remarkable than the appearance of this short, plain woman of uncertain age in a brown ulster and a black straw bonnet. She was very dark, with the dull, lustreless complexion of a skin which is thick as well as sallow. The contour of the face was broad, and the features, though not large, were clumsily moulded. The mouth was the best of them, the lips were well formed, and the line which divided them suggestive of calm and even sweetness. With this, something in the upper part of the face clashed strangely. Evelyn, the quickest observer of all present, was the first to discover that this effect was produced by the curious angle formed by the thick black eyebrows, which declined abruptly from the temples towards the nose. "Pray sit down, mademoiselle," said Mrs. Merrington, when the ceremony of introduction was completed. "I am sure you will be glad of a cup of tea after your journey. Do you take sugar?" "No sugar, no milk, thank you, madame." The voice in which those words were spoken was low and deep, and, as Evelyn again observed, of so penetrating a quality that every syllable might have been heard at the further end of the long drawing-room in which they sat. "I am afraid you found the drive from the station very tedious," said Mrs. Merrington, politely. "No, madame," replied Mademoiselle Ixe, who, it appeared, always softened her English sentences by titles borrowed from a more courteous tongue. "I was interested in watching the country. I looked for, but I did not perceive, the beautiful castle of which Lady Carline has spoken to me so many times." "Beautiful castle? That must be Lingford Castle." "Yes, madame, I think so." "It lies quite in the opposite direction. It is a very fine place," said Mrs. Merrington, looking at Parry, who was now handing cakes to the ladies. "It belongs to Mr. Lethbridge." "Indeed," said Mademoiselle Ixe, glancing quickly towards that young gentleman. "Mr. Lethbridge is fortunate." "Will belong to me, you mean, Mrs. Merrington," said Parry, rather moodily, "if I live long enough." "I think you may last for 3 years yet with care, Parry," said Mr. Merrington, half satirically, half admiringly, contemplating the tall, deep-chested, broad-shouldered young man. "Mr. Lethbridge does not succeed to his property till he is 23, explained Mrs. Merrington. "The trustees have let it, the castle, I mean, to his half-brother, Mr. Cosmo Fox." "The husband of the beauty," said Mademoiselle Ixe. "Some people consider her so," said Mrs. Merrington, coldly. "She is perfectly lovely," cried Evelyn, with enthusiasm. "She is the handsomest woman in the county," said Mr. Merrington. "Oh, I don't know about that," said Parry, looking lovingly at Evelyn's blonde head. "I consider Miss Duncombe better looking," said Mrs. Barnes. From under Mademoiselle Ixe's heavy brows a steady and penetrating gaze travelled slowly and curiously from one speaker to the other, whilst her lips preserved an expression of amiable deference. "I suppose," was her next remark, "that they live much in the world, Mr. and Mrs. Cosmo Fox, and receive a great deal at their beautiful home." "Yes, worse luck," observed Parry. "You do not like society, monsieur?" "It depends what society it is," said Parry, somewhat sententiously. "Mr. Lethbridge only cares for people who can kill something," explained Evelyn, disdainfully. "Well, I do," avowed Parry, colouring. "I like a man to be a sportsman. Don't you, Mr. Merrington?" "Certainly, my dear boy." I hate a fellow who daren't wet his feet and can't load his own gun, and I hate foreigners," he would have said, but with a rare visitation of tact checked himself and substituted Germans, concluding from her accent that the stranger could not possibly belong to that people. "Mr. Cosmo Fox has a great many foreign friends," observed Mrs. Merrington. "He lived abroad a good deal when he was in the diplomatic service." Mrs. Barnes's prolonged and most unwonted silence was not the symptom of an idle or inattentive mind. Her endeavour had been by silent observation of the newcomer to discover what kind of person she might be, and now, finding herself completely baffled, she adopted a different method of inquiry. "You speak English so fluently," she began in her high, harsh voice. "I suppose you know England very well?" "Not England, madame," replied the foreign governess with a modulation of her words that, after Mrs. Barnes's uncompromising tone, sounded wooingly gentle. "The English I have learned to know well abroad. This is my first visit to England. I have only been a week here." "Indeed! You must already have noticed a great difference between this and every other country." "Indeed I do, madame." But this was not the information of which Mrs. Barnes was in quest. She made another attempt upon a different line. "Do you consider the Roman Catholic Church is gaining ground in your country?" "No, madame. On the contrary, the Roman Catholic Church is losing ground." "You mean in all over the Continent, madame?" "I am thankful to hear it," cried Mrs. Merrington fervently. "But what takes its place?" cried Mrs. Barnes. "Nothing can take its place, madame." "Ha! And the people, what becomes of them?" "Well, madame, they adopt emancipated opinions of various kinds, chiefly atheistic." "Just what I imagined." "But why do they not become Protestants?" cried Mrs. Merrington, in an aggrieved tone, exasperated by this instance of human perversity. "It would be little good if they did," said Mrs. Barnes, "for the Protestant sects abroad are all, it is well known, beyond the pale of the Catholic and Apostolic Church." Mrs. Barnes, as she spoke, looked steadily and defiantly at the martyr to Protestant convictions, but Mademoiselle Ixe's only acknowledgment of the assertion was a bland smile which would have been equally, or perhaps more, appropriate if Mrs. Barnes had said that it was a fine day. Mrs. Merrington coughed and suggested that Mademoiselle Ixe might like to see her room. "I think she is nice," observed Mrs. Merrington, looking cheerfully and inquiringly around when the door had closed behind Evelyn and the new governess. "She seems to me a plain, sensible young woman." "There is certainly no doubt about her being plain," said Mr. Merrington dryly. "As to young, that is a matter of opinion. But if she is as sensible as she is plain, she ought to do." "By George, yes. She isn't handsome," said Parry, standing on the hearthrug and looking straight before him, as if he saw her still and marvelled at her lack of beauty. "For my part," said Mrs. Merrington, with some dignity, being wounded by the disparaging tone of these comments, "I think good looks are rather out of place in a governess." "I quite agree with you," said Mrs. Barnes, "and I have nothing to say against her looks or her dress, which, for a foreigner, is in wonderfully good taste. But I wish, my dear Mrs. Merrington, you knew something more about her connections and her opinions. She was very reserved about it all, did you notice?" "Well, you see, it is altogether rather a painful subject. I did not like to be too pressing at first, you know, but in a few days I have no doubt we shall know more. As to her religion, I feel sure that is quite safe, because my sister is so very particular." At this Mrs. Barnes drew her lips tightly together, as if repressing an overwhelming reply, and then gravely took her leave. The men withdrew also, leaving poor Mrs. Merrington, who was keenly sensitive to other people's opinions, in a state of some discouragement. From this, however, she was happily rescued by Evelyn half an hour later. "She is getting on beautifully with the children. They have actually begun by doing what she tells them. I wonder why," said Evelyn, looking dreamily out of the window, and speaking as much to herself as to her mother. "They were so different at first, with Miss West, for instance, who made so much of them at once. The very first afternoon, directly she had put everything in order in the schoolroom, they set to work to make it all in a mess again. Now Mademoiselle Ixe first looks round as she is taking off her gloves, and in a matter-of-course way says, "It is nearly 6 o'clock. You will not have the room tidy by tea time unless you begin to put your things away and arrange the furniture directly." And they actually began doing so. Poor darlings! I always said that all they required was a little tact. And Winifred, too, that peevish little thing, who will hardly make friends with any one, never shrieked when Mademoiselle Ixe spoke to her, and even let her take her in her arms for half a minute. Winifred is a sweet child, Evelyn, only nobody understands her. How is it Mademoiselle Ixe understands her, I wonder? She said she was a child who would require a very gentle hand, as her nerves were too irritable. "I am sure I shall like her," cried Mrs. Merrington, enthusiastically. "I feel sure I shall. She seems so nice and quiet." At this point, however, they separated. Evelyn could never have admired anybody for being nice and quiet, nor did she consider that Mademoiselle Ixe deserved to be so described. The new governess declined to dine with the family that evening, but joined them later on in the drawing-room. Mrs. Merrington found subject for approbation in Mademoiselle Ixe's attire, as being, like herself, nice and quiet. Evelyn, on the contrary, thought she had never seen anything less gracefully arranged than the black folds which fell loosely around the sturdy figure. She was, however, too intent upon the woman herself to have much attention to spare for the fashion of her garments. She made haste to open the grand piano, feeling certain that Mademoiselle Ixe's playing, like herself, would be remarkable. Never had Evelyn been more disappointed. Mademoiselle Ixe's performance displayed brilliant powers of execution, but nothing more. What more, indeed, could have been done, Evelyn reflected, with the piece selected? St. Cecilia herself might have failed to infuse with musical life a succession of scales and arpeggios which was supposed to imitate the murmur of rippling water. "That is perfectly charming," cried Mrs. Merrington. "That is the kind of music I like." "I chose it especially for you, madame," said Mademoiselle Ixe, and she played another of the same sort. "I hope you will teach Evelyn some of these pretty things," said Mrs. Merrington. "There is something so ladylike about them. Evelyn is too fond of wild music without any tune in it. My dear, is not that a sweet thing which Mademoiselle Ixe has just played?" "I don't pretend to be a judge of music," answered Mr. Merrington from his deep chair beside the fire, "but if you ask my opinion, I like something very soft. I don't think music can be too soft." "I quite understand," said Mademoiselle Ixe, and then she played something which was rather monotonous, and never rose above pianissimo. "Ah, that is very nice," said Mr. Merrington, and he fell fast asleep. "I feel so tired," announced Mrs. Merrington, after her invariable custom about 9:45, "that I really must go to bed. Evelyn, my darling, you will see that Mademoiselle Ixe has everything she wants. And please, mademoiselle, do not allow her to sit up late over her novel, as she is inclined to do." But a little time after Mr. and Mrs. Merrington had departed, the novel lay unheeded on Evelyn's lap. Mademoiselle Ixe was playing again, this time something which was neither soft nor sweet. Evelyn had listened often enough in English concert rooms and drawing rooms to this music of Eastern Europe, which the West admires but hardly comprehends. For one reason, because in the West it is rarely heard. More than the utmost mechanical precision and ordinary good taste is required for the interpretation of this strange musical tongue. Whatever this mysterious faculty may be, Mademoiselle Ixe undoubtedly possessed it, and Evelyn, listening to her, discovered that she had never until then heard anything but the letter of this music, and the spirit of it thus revealed was anguish that cannot rest, torment that sees no outlet on earth, no comfort in heaven, the shadow of an unrighteous and pitiless dominion in which the hope of generations has fainted and their faith has waxed dim. Evelyn was too ignorant of other races than her own, as well as of their histories past or present, to understand all this, but she felt that she was hearing the cry of a sorrow too deep for her to fathom, and when the playing ceased, and nothing was heard but the comfortable noises of the ticking clock and the crackling coal-fire, she looked round upon the scene and symbols of her tranquil everyday life as one might have done who had been wandering with Dante in the circles of the lost. "How beautifully you play!" exclaimed Evelyn, as they passed into the hall together. "I suppose you have had lessons from many different masters?" "Yes, but my last was the best." "Indeed! He taught very well, I suppose?" "Yes, very well. He is severe, cruel even." "I don't think I should like him." "It is very possible. He is not much sought after. Still, his method is unequalled. That which he teaches you can rarely forget." The light of the candle which Evelyn had just given to Mademoiselle Ixe, flickering on her dark face, gave to it a singular expression as she spoke these words, over which Evelyn pondered, wondering, till she fell asleep. She had never longed for any third volume so eagerly as she longed for her first interview with the new governess next day. As her lesson hour was not till the afternoon, it seemed likely she would have to bridle her impatience until then, but Mademoiselle Ixe and her younger pupils returned from their morning walk so early that Evelyn was able to propose a turn in the grounds before luncheon. Mademoiselle Ixe readily consented, and Evelyn led the way, her favourite one for a morning saunter. They went along a broad gravel walk, which skirted the front and one side of the house, and then led through a thick shrubbery into the kitchen garden. "It is not exactly pretty here, but it is dry and warm," said Evelyn, as they followed a gravel path, sheltered from the north by high red walls and a phalanx of elms in the park outside. They walked up and down, inhaling the sweet scents of the sun-steeped garden, and hearing the fussy rooks cawing hoarsely overhead. "You have a charming home," said Mademoiselle Ixe, thoughtfully, speaking in French, as she always did with her pupils. "Yes," replied Evelyn undecidedly, "it is very dull." "Dull," repeated Mademoiselle Ixe, with a quaint foreign pronunciation of the word. "Is dull the same as ennuyeux?" "No, I think not. A person is ennuyé because he or she cannot be easily amused. Now, I can enjoy things well enough if only there is anything particular to enjoy." "How? If there were anything to enjoy, you who have youth, health, beauty. But what is the good of all that without if one lives in a desert?" "Ah, you require an audience." "No, but I should like to spend some months at least in a gayer place than this." "London, perhaps, in the season?" "Yes, it is quite natural, is it not?" "Perfectly. And you will later?" "No. Papa says now that he only gets half his rents he cannot afford it." "Ah, it is always like that in life. Something invariably is wanting. All that I can say to console you, dear child, is that the real London season is very different to that smiling image you form of it. In reality, do you see, however agreeable it may be, there is always something displeasing, something prosaic, which one never finds in castles in the air. And again, let me assure you, you might make the round of London seasons without once meeting an admirer so devoted and so worthy as you already possess." "Who can that be?" "Mr. Lethbridge." "Perry? Is that all?" "Why do you speak of him thus? I can only imagine one drawback. All your family would be enchanted if you accepted him. I avow that is unromantic. Still, one cannot have everything, and there is so much to attract you. He is so honest, so affectionate, so strong, so handsome." "Handsome? I never thought of his being handsome. I suppose he is. He is a dear old thing in some ways, but so stupid." "Ah, but no, mademoiselle. You deceive yourself. His intelligence is slow, but, forgive me, in some things more dependable than your own. His forte is in action, not in thought. Ask him for an idea, I admit he has not one to give you, but for action, prompt, bold, and to the point, that is another thing." "It is true," said Evelyn with some animation. "It was certainly Perry's coolness and presence of mind which saved us all when the horses ran away down Tidbury Hill, and But how," she said, stopping suddenly and looking at Mademoiselle Ixe, "how do you know all this about him?" "I have learnt to read character as one interprets cipher. His is very easy. It is as transparent as pure water. It hides nothing, because it has nothing to hide. I congratulate you on your admirer, mademoiselle." "Perry is very well, but he is dull, and it is the same with everything else. My life here is very happy, but it is so dull. I sometimes think I should like a little less happiness if it might make life less dull." "You do not know what you are saying," said Mademoiselle Ixe gravely. They had left the garden during this conversation, and now they emerged from the shrubbery. They saw before them the smooth lawn and trimmed foreign shrubs of the pleasure grounds, and the park with its winter-bleached sward and leafless trees declining to the valley, where the thatched roofs, red chimneys, and one tall spire marked the undulating line of the little village street. There was not a cloud in all the pale blue sky, the smoke from the cottage fires rose straight into the windless air, and in the great stillness noises from the hollow and the further hill came clearly to them: the bleating of lambs, the barking of a chained dog, the creak of wagon wheels, and the shrill voices of children upon the road, all blended and mellowed by distance into a sweet and melancholy murmur. "What a landscape!" said Mademoiselle Ixe. "What tranquillity! What peace! It is asleep." She lowered her voice in saying these last words, as if she feared to waken something. "Do you admire it so much?" "I do not know. It was not of its beauty I was thinking. I am not certain that I care much for beauty. That scandalizes you, does it not? It is heresy. Ah, when I was as young and as happy as you, I, too, cared for beauty. Now it is different. I am too tired." The bright spring daylight shining mercilessly on her face as she spoke disclosed to Evelyn, intently watching her, deep lines round the mouth and eyes which strangely moved the young girl's pity, she hardly knew why. They were indeed the grim characters of suffering rather than of time, and in Evelyn's faulty and selfish little nature there lay the saving grace of sympathy for others. "No, I do not care for beauty or for joy," continued Mademoiselle Ixe. "Rest and peace. Behold my heaven." "Rest and peace!" lightly repeated Evelyn, though struggling against a strong inclination to cry. "If that is heaven, I don't think I should care for heaven." "Probably not," said Mademoiselle Ixe quietly. "We never, I suppose, appreciate heaven till we have at least looked into hell." The first luncheon bell began ringing, and they proceeded at once to the house. Evelyn was late that day for luncheon, for when she reached her room she stood motionless, looking straight before her, wrapped in meditation, from which she was only roused by the second bell. "Whoever or whatever Mademoiselle Ixe may be," was her conclusion, "she is certainly not dull." Chapter 2 of Mademoiselle Ixe by Lanoe Falconer. Is in the public domain. Evelyn had the discretion not to repeat Mademoiselle Ixe's somewhat enigmatical remarks, for, however interesting, it could not be said to come under Mrs. Merrington's favourite category of nice, and would have seriously disturbed that lady's opinion of her new governess, which was now very high indeed. It was an undeniable fact that the children, two girls aged respectively 10 and 8, and the boy who came between them, had hitherto given a good deal of trouble to their governesses, and the only moot point was whether this trouble was due to the incapacity of the teachers or the intractability of the pupils. Mrs. Merrington's decision may be easily divined. She, indeed, herself found the children difficult to manage, and was generally flushed and exhausted by an hour of their company, but she consoled herself by describing what other people called disobedience as spirit, and firmly believed that it was nothing worse. Still, this view of the case did not affect certain troublesome results. These, however, ceased with Mademoiselle Ixe's accession. Mrs. Merrington was no longer assailed by that odious and too familiar prelude, "I am sorry to trouble you, Mrs. Merrington, but really the children—" Complaints, indeed, she received by the bushel, and this time from the children. Their new governess was, they repeatedly declared, a monster of cruelty, who starved and ill-treated them, and made their life a misery to them. But the force of these representations, even on Mrs. Merrington's tender heart, was diminished by the sight of the victims sporting joyously with their tyrant in the schoolroom gallery or the shrubbery walks, or clinging fondly to her arm as she paced up and down, telling one of her engrossing and interminable stories. It is true that in school time their relations were not so pleasant. Then, on the contrary, it was war to the knife, and many a weary battle was fought in which Mademoiselle Ixe triumphed gloriously in virtue of the tremendous power of inertia. For when the children were in wild rebellion around her, shrieking and gesticulating and tossing books and slates defiantly about, Mademoiselle Ixe neither stormed like the Fraulein, lectured like Miss Olivier, or wept like Miss West, but sat quietly at her desk, observing their gambols with a look of good-humoured attention, and carefully noting with a bad mark every fresh act of insubordination. It was not that she controlled her impatience; she appeared to have none to control. "They agitate my nerves," she exclaimed almost scornfully one day, in answer to some words of condolence from Evelyn. "Poor little cats! If my nerves were so easily irritated, I should have been dead long ago. Freddy, my cherished one, behold 7 bad marks against your name." This indulgent frame of mind did not prevent her exacting the uttermost farthing of the penalty when the time of reckoning came, which it did when the children were worn out with their exertions, and Mademoiselle Ixe was fresh and unwearied as at the beginning of the day. Then that dreary score of marks had to be worked out in punishments of various kinds. Extra lessons had to be learnt, play hours were curtailed, fines were administered, and sweets and puddings rigorously denied. It was then that they recounted their wrongs to Mrs. Merrington. They forgot them altogether in the recreation hours, when Mademoiselle Ixe worked with them in their gardens, played with them at their games, and shared in all their amusements with as much zeal as a child, and a far less inconvenient affection for her own way than a child of their type would certainly have displayed. "Do these games amuse you?" said Evelyn once to Mademoiselle Ixe, as the latter paused breathless beside her during a lively game of hide-and-seek in the shrubbery. "Amuse me? I should think not. It is not for amusement I play. It is to gain an influence over these funny little hearts. After all, they fatigue me less than the diversions of older people. These only tire my muscles. The others weary me, brain, heart, and soul. What would you? To succeed in this world one must adapt oneself, and one must efface one's individuality on every side." "Do you efface yourself with me, mademoiselle?" "Less," said Mademoiselle Ixe, laying her finger tenderly on the girl's soft, round cheek, and looking into her eyes with the smile that sometimes brightened and even beautified the dark foreign face. "Character, like fate, is capricious. In one corner of your fresh little heart there is something which responds to my withered one. I am compelled to open it to you. Adieu. I resume my rôle of bébé." This declaration seemed to throw some light on the protean character of Mademoiselle Ixe's moods, which varied, so it seemed to Evelyn, according to the society in which she might happen to be. The Mademoiselle Ixe who listened respectfully to Mrs. Merrington's reflections on things in general, or Mr. Merrington's views about cattle and turnips, was a very different person from the Mademoiselle Ixe who unbent herself with Evelyn. The girl's growing admiration was at times disturbed by this flexibility of character, which appeared almost to verge on insincerity. And yet, on reflection, she could not accuse Mademoiselle Ixe of having, under any circumstances, denied herself or her convictions. She avoided this, apparently, by a somewhat oracular manner of delivering her opinions. Evelyn was very anxious to take part in private theatricals. "I should so like to try and act," she said one day in the drawing-room. "I wish Mrs. Fox would give some theatricals, as she promised she would, and let me take part. I think acting must be delightful." "It is a very important part of a good education," said Mademoiselle Ixe. "I must say I am old-fashioned enough not to approve of young ladies acting," observed Mrs. Merrington. "I was not talking of acting on the stage, madame." This reply perfectly satisfied Mrs. Merrington. "I thought you wouldn't," she said complacently. "In my young days such a thing was never heard of, and I cannot think it nice at all. And as to ladies making speeches in public, as they do now, I think it most improper. There is Miss Smith, an archdeacon's daughter. At the last meeting of the Girls' Friendly Society she stood up on a platform, a regular platform with steps on each side, and lectured away to us all. She said it was not a speech, because she read it from a paper, but it seemed to me much the same thing in the end." "Quite the same, madame." "And there were gentlemen present, too. Clergymen, of course, but it is just as bad. If ladies can do such things at religious meetings, they can do it anywhere, I suppose. Really, they might as well go into Parliament at once." "Quite as well, madame. Ladies are too fond of meddling in everything nowadays, and it is a very great mistake. A woman ought to keep to her own sphere." "I quite agree with you, madame." "I thought you would. Now, our last governess was quite the contrary. She used to try and persuade me that ladies had as much to do with politics as gentlemen." "She must have been a very foolish woman, madame." "Well, so I thought, though she was very highly educated, indeed, almost too much so. I think she had quite muddled her brains with logic and mathematics. Certainly she talked very well, quite like a gentleman, and had wonderful reasons for everything. She used to say that women of property ought to have votes, and she used almost to persuade Mr. Merrington to take her side. But she could not convince me with all her arguments." "No, madame, I am sure no arguments would convince you." The last observation, which Mrs. Merrington accepted as a compliment, struck Evelyn as exactly the reverse, and led her to review the whole dialogue. But if a cloud of doubt or disapproval gathered in her mind, it was dispelled directly she and her governess were left together by the magnetic charm of Mademoiselle Ixe's personality, in which sweetness, irony, and sadness were blended into the most bewitching whole. "If I were a man, I should fall in love with you," said Evelyn, thoughtfully, one day. "Heaven be praised that you are not, then. Such a sentiment would be highly inconvenient for me, and also for poor Mr. Lethbridge." Mr. Lethbridge, oddly enough, did not reciprocate this kindly feeling. From the first, Mademoiselle Ixe had inspired him with a vague sensation of distrust and suspicion, for which he was unable to account, having, as he confessed, no graver charges to urge against her than the enormous size of her feet and hands. "How could we expect him to like any one who is not English?" was Evelyn's sarcastic comment. Parry looked deprecatingly at her, but did not attempt to defend himself. "What is she? French?" he inquired presently. "No, she isn't French," answered Evelyn. "I think she must be German." "No, I'll be sworn that she is not German," said Mr. Merrington, whose mind had been poisoned against that nation by his experience of the Fräulein. "She is too clean for that." "But how odd it is you don't know," said Parry. "She's been more than a week in the house, hasn't she? Haven't you asked her?" "Oh, yes, I have asked her," said Mrs. Merrington. "Have you, mamma?" cried Evelyn. "What did she say?" "Well, I don't quite remember all. It was a very long story, poor thing. I can see she has had a great deal of trouble in her life, and her family, I am afraid, have not behaved to her as they ought. She does not care to speak about it much, just as your aunt said, you know, and I am sure it is very natural." "But did you not discover to what country this ill-behaved family belonged?" asked Mr. Merrington. "She did tell me, at least she told me her mother was a native of . I forget the name of the place, but it is a very out-of-the-way town in Italy, or the south of France, I think. I fancy her father and her mother were different. I mean, belonged to different countries." "Well, I must say you do not seem to have extracted much information," observed Mr. Merrington. "I dare say she would have told me more if I had asked her," said Mrs. Merrington, somewhat piqued. "I am sure I don't care whether she is French or Italian, or what she is. She teaches the children very well, and she seems a perfect lady. I don't know what else one can want." Mrs. Barnes, however, wanted a great deal more. She wanted to know once for all to which church or sect Mademoiselle Ixe belonged. "I believe she is an Italian Protestant," Mrs. Merrington had replied. "You believe, my dear Mrs. Merrington? Is it possible you do not know? Do you mean to say she makes a secret of her religion?" Mrs. Merrington hastily repudiated this suggestion. She had approached the subject as delicately as possible with Mademoiselle, who had been perfectly open and communicative, but her religious confidences did not seem to have left a more definite impression on Mrs. Merrington's memory than the account of her nationality. Mrs. Barnes looked very grave. "I should like Mr. Barnes to see her. I think he ought to ask her a few questions. When can you come down and have tea with us, Mrs. Merrington, you and Evelyn and Mademoiselle Ixe?" An invitation so worded is not easily declined, and Mrs. Merrington felt obliged to accept this for the following Tuesday. So on the afternoon of that day Evelyn was sent to summon Mademoiselle Ixe. She found the new governess in the schoolroom, sitting on the floor and cautiously adding the last story to a tall and tremulous structure of wooden bricks, whilst beside her a little wan-faced child watched the progress of the building with solemn intentness. Winifred, who was generally crying when with her nurse, and fretting when with her mother, was comparatively placid with Mademoiselle Ixe. A curious friendship united these two from the very first. "Poor little one, she is unhappy," Mademoiselle Ixe had once said in reply to some one who expressed surprise at her affection for this sickly, spoilt, and most unwinning child. But the secret of Winifred's attachment for Mademoiselle Ixe remained untold. Evelyn delivered Mrs. Merrington's message in a somewhat displeased tone, and added, "I hate going to Mrs. Barnes. If she is alone, I get tired of hearing her scrapey voice. If there are other visitors, it is not much livelier, for they seem half afraid to speak or to laugh." "Ah, well, it does not matter," said Mademoiselle Ixe, philosophically. "As well be bored in Mrs. Barnes' drawing-room as anywhere else." "But I don't want to be bored anywhere." "Such is youth. Do you know what a French writer has said? At 40 one thanks heaven when one is only moderately unhappy. Winifred, my little one, come into Mademoiselle's room and help her to dress." They found Mrs. Barnes' drawing-room almost crowded. Chance, not Mrs. Barnes, was responsible for this. She was especially anxious to have had the Merrington party all to herself, and accordingly visitors arrived from every quarter. Mr. Harold of Stacy Court, on his way home from hunting, Lady Duncombe and her daughter, Mrs. Mason, wife of the curate at Tidbury, Mr. Golding, the new clergyman from Barton, of whom little was yet known, save that he preached in a black gown. Mrs. Barnes, however, was not to be frustrated in her good intentions. She found a place close beside her own for Mrs. Merrington, and established Mademoiselle Ixe and Evelyn on the opposite side of the room. Then, when the whole party had been provided with tea and cake, and Mademoiselle Ixe might be supposed to be occupied with the conversation of those around her, Mrs. Barnes, addressing Mrs. Merrington, began: "I had a letter this morning from my great friend, Miss West. She was in Florence 2 or 3 years ago, and when there she heard a great deal about your present governess. She was then giving lessons in a Mr. and Mrs. Payne's family. Mr. and Mrs. Payne are very intimate friends of Miss West's, and very staunch church people. It seems Mademoiselle Ixe had been giving their children lessons in French and music for months, but at the end of that time, just when Miss West arrived, in fact, they felt themselves obliged very reluctantly to withdraw them from her charge." "Dear me!" "As a governess they had nothing to say against her. She taught very well indeed, and the children were very much attached to her, but it appears that she had no religious principles." "No religious principles?" "None. I told you that foreign Protestants rarely had, but this is one of the worst cases I ever heard of. She went to the English church with the Paynes, but they learnt by accident that a few months before, when she happened to be teaching Roman Catholic pupils, she always accompanied them to Mass. Before that she attended the Italian Protestant temple with some Protestant ladies. In fact, she went wherever her pupils happened to go at the time she was with them, and on one occasion, said Mrs. Barnes, sinking her voice to a tragic depth, she took part in a Unitarian prayer meeting. I am sure there must be some mistake. My sister is so very particular, and Mademoiselle Ixe seems in every way such an excellent person, so kind to the children, and so obliging and unselfish. But, my dear Mrs. Merrington, what on earth has all that got to do with religion? As Mrs. Merrington paused, struck dumb by this unanswerable objection, the door opened and Mr. Barnes entered. His arrival was very welcome to the whole company, for at the other end of the room they were just a little dull. A heavy though invisible cloud, which often brooded over social gatherings in this neighbourhood, had not been dispelled by tea. The only topics afforded by this dullest of all seasons, such as the state of the weather and the roads and the probable return of the Cosmo Foxes, had been introduced and exhausted. Mr. Harold had attempted to bring forward his favourite subject, the misdoings of the Liberal Government, but the ladies were too feminine to take much interest in politics, and he was in no way supported by Mr. Golding, who, with an unmistakable frown, was glancing over a church paper he had found on the table near him. Things had come to such a pass that Lady Duncan and Mrs. Mason were now seriously debating whether the vicar's wife at Tidbury, by a more judicious arrangement of her house and her household, might not find room for another servant. "I hope you are amused," Evelyn had ironically observed in an undertone to Mademoiselle Ixe. "Perfectly, I thank you." "It is gay, is it not?" "Ah, for example, no. You English, when you amuse yourselves, are never gay. You have a way peculiar to yourselves of doing everything. It is very interesting." Mr. Barnes' entrance and the greetings which followed broke up the stiff circle into which the guests had formed, and revived the drooping spirit of conversation. "You are late, my dear," said Mrs. Barnes, carrying a cup of tea across to him, where he stood near Mr. Golding and Mademoiselle Ixe. "Yes, I just stopped to look in at the church where the school children are practising with Mr. Morris. He is teaching them that new Benedictus." Then, turning toward Mr. Golding, he added, "I do not know what sort of a choir you have found at Barton." "I know nothing about it," said Mr. Golding, curtly. Mr. Barnes opened his eyes, and Mrs. Barnes glanced severely at the speaker. At another time she would not have allowed such an avowal to pass unrebuked, but Mademoiselle Ixe at this moment absorbed all her attention. The company became quite lively, as every one had something to say about his or her choir, and Mrs. Barnes decided that the moment was favourable, under cover of this, to begin the investigation on which her heart was set. She gave a premonitory cough for her husband's benefit, and then observed to Mademoiselle Ixe, in that forced and unnatural manner in which people are apt to speak when they wish their remarks to sound as unpremeditated and spontaneous as possible, "I hear you are a great musician, mademoiselle. Have you had much experience in choir training? Church choirs, I mean?" "Alas, no, madame. I believe some of our choirs abroad are very good just now, in the Anglican churches, that is. I don't know if you belong to the Anglican Church." The last sentence, though worded as an assertion, was distinctly delivered as a question, and Mrs. Barnes paused for a reply. Mademoiselle Ixe hesitated only for an instant, during which brief space her glance flashed from face to face of the trio. Mr. Barnes still standing, still sipping his tea on one side, Mrs. Barnes erect and expectant before her, Mr. Golding, who had tossed the paper aside with an angry "Pshaw!" and appeared now attentive to this dialogue. Then she looked downward and said pensively, "Unfortunately, no, madame. I have often desired to join your charming church, but there are so many difficulties about it." "Indeed," said Mr. Barnes, laying down his cup. "To what difficulties in particular do you allude?" "Well, first," said Mademoiselle Ixe, touching the forefinger of her left hand, as if about to begin a somewhat lengthy enumeration, "there is the apostolic succession. Never have I been able to understand whether you possess it or not." "Is that all?" cried Mr. Golding. "It is certainly not an article of faith," said Mr. Barnes, in reply to the tone of Mr. Golding's comment. "Still, no doubt the question is a very important one, for our right as clergy of the Catholic Church of England to exercise our priestly functions rests entirely on the assumption that we possess the apostolic succession." "Exactly what Mr. Jones used to tell me," said Mademoiselle Ixe, clasping her hands. "Then I must venture to differ from Mr. Jones and Mr. Barnes, too," said Mr. Golding, with the aspect of a man preparing himself for battle. "Our right to exercise what Mr. Barnes calls our priestly functions, by which I understand him to mean our right to conduct the public services of the national Church, rests on no such assumption, and it is well it does not, for as a matter of fact, historical fact, we do not possess the apostolic succession." "And that is what Mr. Browne used to assure me," cried Mademoiselle Ixe, despairingly. "You see, my dear madame, how embarrassing all this is for a foreigner." "It is not at all embarrassing," cried Mrs. Barnes, looking angrily at Mr. Golding. "If you will listen to Mr. Barnes, he will soon make it plain to you, or to any one else, that we do possess the apostolic succession." "I defy him to do that," cried Mr. Golding. Mr. Barnes would willingly have adjourned the debate to a more convenient season, if not for ever, but neither Mrs. Barnes nor Mr. Golding would consent to this, and, thanks to these ardent and uncompromising spirits, a prolonged and animated debate ensued, in which Mademoiselle Ixe and her difficulties were very soon forgotten. It raged with undiminished ardour when Mrs. Merrington and her companions were obliged to take their leave. Mrs. Merrington drove homewards in the carriage, leaving the other two, at their own especial desire, to follow at their leisure and on foot. It was very quiet and sweet and cool outside the vicarage. They stood for a few seconds by the gate, looking back over the churchyard and the gardens with a pleasant sense of rest after storm. It was the evening of a rainy day. The thick, unbroken cloud that covered all the sky was lifted towards the west above a deep of purple pale yellow, whilst the glow of it, streaming faintly over the creeping river and the sodden meadows, folded, as in a mystic haze, the massed darkness of the church and the star-proof blackness of the yews beside it. Lights sparkled brightly in the chancel windows. The children were still singing, and through the open church door their fresh young voices, upborne by the roll of the organ, rang forth triumphantly. Even the words they sang were audible. "To give light to them that sit in darkness and in the shadow of death, and to guide our feet into the way of peace." Mademoiselle Ixe smiled as she listened, and uttered a sound which Evelyn thought was like, and yet strangely unlike, a laugh. She looked quickly and curiously at the foreign profile standing out in almost discordant relief against the peaceful English background. "Do these words amuse you?" she asked. "Amuse me? Oh, no! Still, sung like that, in a land like this, they make one smile as one smiles over Oh, my lovely child, can you imagine what the shadow of death is?" "No," answered Evelyn, with a slight shudder. "Can you?" "I? I am one of the people who live continually in it. Come, it is late. We must go." As they passed the little village post office, the postmistress's daughter, with a letter in her hand, hurried out to catch them. "I beg your pardon, miss, for troubling you, I am sure," she said to Evelyn, "but do you think as this could be for any one at the mansion? 'Tis such a strange name, we don't seem hardly to know how to read it." Evelyn took the letter from her. Its thin envelope was covered with foreign and English postmarks, and numerous addresses, all erased but the last. "It is not for any one I know," said Evelyn, after a glance at the very singular name, which was all that was left of the original direction. "Excuse me," said Mademoiselle Ixe, "it is for me." She put out her hand, and Evelyn, of course, instantly resigned to her the letter. Mademoiselle Ixe put it in her pocket, the postmistress's daughter retired satisfied and relieved, and the two ladies walked silently home. If Mademoiselle Ixe's thoughts were busy over the inside of the letter, Evelyn's were no less occupied with the outside, for she had seen enough of it to be positively certain that the mysterious name upon the envelope, whatever it might be, bore not the faintest resemblance to Ixe. Chapter 3 of Mademoiselle Ixe by Lanoe Falconer. This recording is in the public domain. It was well that Mrs. Merrington was spared the sight of the letter, for she returned home, sufficiently disturbed as it was by Mrs. Barnes' suggestions. Mr. Merrington, to whom after dinner she confided these anxieties, made light of them, after his usual easy and somewhat unorthodox fashion. "Oh, pooh! If she does her work well, what does it matter what her views are?" was his conclusion, "especially as she doesn't trouble us with them. Eve, you are a nice young lady, upon my word. You never told that unfortunate Perry that you were going out to tea, and he has been kicking his heels half the afternoon waiting to see you." "Why, what could he have to say to me?" "Amongst other things, that the Cosmo Foxes are coming home to-morrow." "I am very glad," said Evelyn. "Mademoiselle Ixe is very anxious to see Mrs. Fox." Mrs. Merrington determined to appeal to her sister, and wrote to her next day to ask for further particulars and assurances concerning Mademoiselle Ixe and her history. The answer, which arrived by return of post, was slightly indignant in tone. "I am not the least surprised," wrote Lady Carline, "to hear that your Puseyite vicar and his wife are not satisfied with that good Bible Christian Mademoiselle Ixe. I earnestly pray that she may be enabled to counteract the effect of Mr. Barnes' pernicious teaching on the minds of the dear children. As to Mrs. Barnes' insinuations, no doubt Mademoiselle Ixe, poor thing, after renouncing her popish idols (I wish Mr. and Mrs. Barnes could say so much for themselves), was for some time rather unsettled as to which was the true faith, but I am happy to say she has for some time found rest in the Italian Protestant Church, a sounder one than our own in many ways. I should think she must be amazed at some of Mr. Barnes' antics in church, if he goes on in the way he did when I was with you. However, if you are not satisfied, pray let me know at once. I can easily get her another situation. Lady Castlemore would be thankful to have her." After reading this, Mrs. Merrington felt not only comforted, but bound to offer some sort of apology to her sister. She was busy over the composition of this when the sound of a distant horn reached her ears, and Evelyn came hurriedly into the drawing-room to announce that the Cosmo Fox's coach was driving up to the house. A few minutes after this, Mr. and Mrs. Cosmo Fox, with Perry, entered the house, and a high-pitched female voice resounded through the hall. "Well, my dear Mrs. Merrington, here we are, you see. We haven't lost any time in coming over, have we? Well, how are you? You all look blooming. After all, I believe country air is the best. Why, Evelyn, I declare you've grown. Yes, you have. And how are the chicks? All very well? I hear you have got a dragon of a governess who keeps them all in fine order. I'm sorry for that. They won't be half so nice. I hate anything kept in order, except husbands. Yes, Mrs. Merrington, husbands should always be kept in order. I do my best with Cosmo, but he is quite incorrigible. How jolly this dear old drawing-room looks, and how nice everything feels after London. Well, now, what has been going on here? I hear one of the Miss Harolds is actually engaged. What a blessing for her mother and the others. Mrs. Masters has been up telling me all the gossip. It is part of her business as a clergyman's wife, you know, to collect all that. Don't you think so? I hear they've got a terrible clergyman at Barton, who gives them sermons half an hour long. Miss Duncombe isn't engaged. I'm sure, from her face. She looks very desponding. We met her and Lady Duncombe on our way here. What do you think I did? I took the reins from Perry and borrowed his cigar till we passed them. Oh, you should have seen Lady Duncombe's face. Cosmo didn't half like it. Afraid I should upset the coach? Nonsense! How nervous you are getting!" During the course of this speech the whole party had established themselves in the drawing-room, whilst greetings and inquiries had been generally exchanged. It was impossible, without suspending the ordinary business of life, to pay unremitting attention to Mrs. Fox's remarks. Fortunately she did not expect it, being too absorbed in the pleasure of talking to be very exacting as to the quality and quantity of her listeners. She usually addressed herself to the company generally, and in that there were sure to be 2 or 3 who willingly listened, or appeared to listen, while watching a creature so lovely. To-day she was provided with 2 faithful admirers in Mr. Merrington and Evelyn, who had taken their places on either side of her. Mr. Cosmo Fox conversed with Mrs. Merrington in the low, soft voice which was usually drowned by his wife's vociferous chatter. "I hope Cosmo and you are not going to run away again directly," said Mrs. Merrington cordially. When Mrs. Fox paused, as she was sometimes compelled to, for breath, "Oh, no, we shall be here till the week after Easter, at least. I shouldn't have come down so soon, only Cosmo took upon himself to ask some people down without consulting me. Yes, he says he asked me if it would suit me to have them on the 15th, and I said yes. Well, so I did, but then I hadn't an idea when the 15th was. I never know anything about dates. I don't want to, or about hours either. Yes, please, cream, milk, sugar, anything you can give me. Muffins? I should think so. I adore muffins. Thanks, thanks. Who are coming to us? Well, let me see. The Austins first. These are the people Cosmo asked. He is rather sweet on Mrs. Austin, between ourselves. Ha, ha! Then Nellie and Katie Woodward. I don't think you know them. Such jolly girls, not pretty, but up to everything. Then my cousin Captain Leslie, you know him. Handsome, isn't he? You mustn't fall in love with him, Evelyn, or Perry will never forgive me. Monsieur Delane and Sir George and Lady Rigby. You remember Lady Rigby? Immense, and the colour of a peony. I think that is all, isn't it, Cosmo? Oh, mercy, yes, I forgot the Count, the most important of them all. His name? Oh, don't ask me his name. I can't either spell or pronounce it. He is a Russian and an old friend of Cosmo's. Well, you knew him years ago, didn't you, when you were abroad? He's very much in love with me. Yes, he is, Cosmo. Very mashed indeed, and so am I. Oh, he is such a darling, and so hideous. Frightful. Do you know the first time I saw him, it was only last week, he has just been in England about a month, I thought he was the missing link. It was at a dance at Lady Dunmere's. You know, she is a Scotchwoman and never sees anything like a joke, so I said, 'Why, Lady Dunmere, it is a gorilla, isn't it?' And she said, quite gravely, 'Oh, no, dear, he is a Russian count.' But he dances divinely, divinely. I wanted him to come down to us at once, for I never was so taken by anyone, but he couldn't come till Thursday next. Is it not tiresome? He has gone off with these stupid Dunmeres to their place in Scotland. I told him he would only catch his death of cold and get caught by that gigantic Miss Dunmere. But perhaps he may come to us sooner after all, for it seems he is very restless and flies about from place to place, just as the fancy moves him, just what I should like to do. How I wish I had married him! And sometimes he goes off quite suddenly, in the middle of a visit. Cosmo thinks it's because— Who on earth is that?" It was Mademoiselle Ixe standing in the doorway. Her eyes had turned naturally enough in the direction of the beautiful speaker, but she had come in with a large bunch of daffodils gathered in the woods for Mrs. Merrington. Finding that the family were not alone, as she had supposed, she hesitated diffidently to enter. Come in, mademoiselle," cried Mrs. Merrington. "You are just in time for tea. You must have a cup. What lovely daffodils!" Perry rose to find her a seat. Evelyn hastened to pour her out a cup of tea, and Mrs. Merrington introduced her to the Cosmo Foxes. Mademoiselle Ixe took the place offered to her next to Mrs. Merrington, and described, in answer to that lady's inquiries, where the daffodils had come from. Meanwhile Mrs. Fox stared at Mademoiselle Ixe with unconcealed astonishment. "Who on earth is she?" she said to Mr. Merrington. "The new governess? What an extraordinary looking person! Where on earth did you pick her up? Chinese, I should think, from her eyebrows. Well, she is ugly." Mrs. Cosmo Fox, like a good many other people, had a habit of assuming that nothing she said could be overheard unless she intended it so to be. Mr. Merrington, who did not share this illusion, began to feel rather uncomfortable, and rose to his feet. "Cosmo," he said, "I want to show you the stables. Since you were here last, I have had them ventilated on a new plan. It works very well. Are you coming, Perry?" With the departure of the men, the exuberance of Mrs. Fox's spirits seemed somewhat to subside. She leant languidly back in her deep chair, and looked round as if in search of amusement. Evelyn, observing this, proposed that Mademoiselle Ixe should play them something. "I ought perhaps to be looking for my pupils," said Mademoiselle Ixe, consulting her watch. "I'll go and see after the children," said Mrs. Merrington, delighted to exchange the task of entertaining Mrs. Cosmo Fox for a much more congenial occupation. "You play some of your pretty pieces to Mrs. Fox." "Do you like music, madame?" asked Mademoiselle Ixe, pausing on her way to the piano beside Mrs. Fox, and according as she did so the most remarkable contrast ever presented by two beings of the same sex, time, and social community. "Well, yes, if it is not too classical," said Mrs. Fox, stifling a yawn and stretching out her hand to take an album from the table. "Now, what will she play?" thought Evelyn, watching the foreign governess curiously. It was something which she had never played before, at least to Evelyn, a waltz with a long undulating measure, and that undertone of sadness which appears inevitable even in the dance music of this troubled age. All this was carefully accentuated by the player, but her dexterous fingers, or something of which they were but the well-trained interpreters, infused a much more potent charm into the swaying melody. The spirit of the dance was in this playing, the essence of that poetry of motion which lives in the rise and fall of wind-tossed boughs and leaping waves, as well as in the rhythmic play of subtle human beauty. Evelyn it affected like a spell, and even the much less susceptible Mrs. Fox was moved and roused by it. "Lovely! Distracting! One must dance to it!" she cried, springing to her feet and rocking to the music with a grace as perfect as her beauty. "The hall is the place to dance in," said Mademoiselle Ixe, without pausing or looking up. "True," said Mrs. Fox. "Evelyn, let us have a waltz there." The hall was very wide and high, rising to the roof of the house, where it was lighted by an enormous skylight. All the chief rooms opened on to it, the bedrooms being reached by the open gallery that went round three sides of the hall. The last side was taken up by two flights of the staircase which led to this gallery, and an enormous piece of tapestry covering nearly all the wall above the stairs. Soft, rich brown was the prevailing hue in wainscoted walls and balustrades, and in the polished floor over which the feet of the young dancers now glided so nimbly. "You play divinely!" cried Mrs. Fox, returning to the drawing-room with quickened breath and heightened colour. "But you have thoroughly unsettled me, and I know I never shall be happy again till I have had a really good dance. London! One never dances in London. One is knocked about, and one's dress is torn. There is no room to dance. The country is the place. Oh, how I wish we had anything like your hall, and I would give a dance to-morrow. But that stupid castle is all cut up into little rooms, and our big hall has a stone floor. I wish to goodness your people would give a dance, Evelyn." "Surely all that Mrs. Fox desires is granted," said Mademoiselle Ixe, still playing, but playing pianissimo. "What, in other people's houses?" said Mrs. Fox, smiling. "Oh, everywhere," said Mademoiselle Ixe, gravely. "Oh, yes," said Evelyn, snatching at the idea presented. "I am sure if papa would give a dance to please any one it would be for you. Oh, dear Mrs. Fox, do ask him. I have never been at a real dance in my life, and I shall be 18 next month." "You poor, ill-used little thing. Well, I don't mind if I do. Where is Mr. Merrington?" As if in answer to this question, the sound of men's voices was heard outside. Mrs. Fox rushed to the window and threw it open. "Mr. Merrington!" she cried, leaning out and clasping her hands with a pretty gesture of entreaty. "I want you to do something to please me. Promise me you won't refuse." "Who could?" said Mr. Merrington, gallantly. "Well, now remember, you have promised. I have witnesses. I want you to give a dance." "A dance?" repeated Mr. Merrington, evidently taken aback. "Quite a tiny one, you know. I don't mean a regular ball. I only want you to let me bring over our party one evening and have a dance in your lovely hall. Now, you must not look like that. You know you have promised." Mr. Cosmo Fox, with his usual sleepy deliberation, took his cigar out of his mouth and began, "I must say, Zephine—" "No, Cosmo, you need not say anything at all. You have nothing to do with this. Now, Mr. Merrington, you don't object, do you?" "Oh, no, I don't object," said Mr. Merrington, who had bethought himself of an excellent way out of the dilemma, "but I am not the person to ask. I am only the master of the house. You must consult my wife, you know." "Thank you, thank you, thank you!" cried Mrs. Fox, kissing her hands to him at each word, and she disappeared from the window. A few minutes later Mrs. Merrington came into the gallery through the red swing door which led from that part of the house to a wing shared by the servants and children. A cry of satisfaction from below instantly greeted her appearance, and as she slowly descended the stairs, Mrs. Cosmo Fox's piercing voice was lifted in explanation of the unusual aspect of the hall. "My dear Mrs. Merrington, such fun! What do you think? Your angel of a husband has invited us and our party to come over and dance one evening in his splendid hall. Isn't it charming? There never was such a place for a ballroom. You see, Mrs. Merrington, by just taking the big chairs out and moving the table up here like this, you get more room than ever, and the piano and the fiddles with a little squeeze might get under the staircase. A small cottage piano, you know. Hawkins generally sends his own. You'd have his men, wouldn't you? They're not expensive. I hate dancing to amateur playing, don't you? They always leave off when they are tired. We shall have 3 dancing men in our party at least, and I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll ask some of the over from Carchester. You'll like that, Evelyn, for they all dance splendidly. They really do. Not like that stupid who do nothing but lounge and eat supper. We haven't settled the day yet, have we? It must be next week, because the week after is Passion Week, and if you gave a dance then, Mr. Barnes would excommunicate you, or rather Mrs. Barnes would. Now all our people come on Saturday. On Mondays we have some old friends to dine. What do you say to Tuesday? I think Tuesday is the day. Do you agree, Mrs. Merrington?" Mrs. Merrington certainly did not object in words, for of them she was bereft by bewilderment and surprise. And Mrs. Cosmo Fox, taking the most desirable view of this silence, burst forth again more eloquently than ever. "Oh, thank you 1,000 times, Mrs. Merrington. Thank you awfully. We shall all make our appearance on Tuesday next. By the by, will you ask any one else, for we are going on to the Harolds. Shall we take them an invitation? I will save you the bother of writing. The son dances very decently, you know, and they really must scrape some men together to balance all these heavy girls. Do you think the Duncombes would come in Lent? I think it would be only kind to give poor Miss Duncombe a chance, and I would like to have Lady Duncombe. I always enjoy flirting so much more when I know she is looking on and taking notes. But then, if you ask her, you will have to ask all the people near Barton, and they are such a hopelessly stupid set. Well, whatever you do, Evelyn, don't forget to engage Hawkins' men in good time. You know, a violoncello, and a piano. I say, won't it be glorious?" The coach was now heard crashing over the gravel sweep before the front door. The servants came into the hall to attend to the departing guests, and at the same instant Mr. Merrington, Mr. Fox, and Parry entered by a side door. "It is 5:30 and more, Zephine," said her husband. "If we are to be home before midnight, we ought to start." "Mr. Merrington," cried Mrs. Fox, "it is all settled. The dance is to be on Tuesday next. We've arranged it all, haven't we, Mrs. Merrington? We shall put our furs and things in your room, I think, Mr. Merrington, and eat our supper in the dining room, and flirt in the drawing room. What is the matter with the clasp of this cloak? I cannot fasten it." "Allow me, madame," said Mademoiselle Ixe. "What the devil is the meaning of all this?" said Mr. Merrington aside to his wife. "You know best, my dear," said the lady coldly. At the same time Mademoiselle Ixe, readjusting the silver clasp of Mrs. Fox's fur cloak, which had got bent in some way, was saying, Did you say all your visitors arrived on Saturday, madame? Yes, all. Have you got it right? Oh, thanks. Because, continued Mademoiselle Ixe, arranging the cloak over Mrs. Fox's shoulder as she spoke, I fancied you spoke of one who will not arrive till Thursday, was it? Mrs. Fox stopped suddenly with a start in the act of fastening her cloak. Gracious goodness! She almost shrieked. Do you know what I've done? I've forgotten all about the Count. He doesn't come till Thursday. He won't be here for the ball. Good-bye, my dear Mrs. Merrington, said Mr. Cosmo Fox gently, as he pressed her hand in a farewell clasp. How your head must ache, and how you will enjoy a little quiet after all this hubbub. My dear Zephine, I will attend to what you say when we get into the carriage. Nothing will induce me to trespass further on Mr. and Mrs. Merrington's patience. And accordingly he left the house and climbed up to his place on the coach. All this time Mrs. Fox protested wildly and continuously, "The Count! The Count! My dear Cosmo, you don't understand. Oh, Perry, stop him! My dear Mrs. Merrington, what are we to do? The dance will be nothing without the Count. You don't know how he waltzes. Put off the dance? Oh, goodness, no, never put off anything pleasant. He must come earlier, that's all, whether the Dunmeres like it or whether they don't. I must write to him to-night and insist upon his coming on Monday or Tuesday at the latest." "You won't be in time for our post," observed Perry, "if that matters. The postman calls for the bag at 6. "Perry," called Mr. Fox from without, "do not wait for Zephine. We will send the carriage back for her." "What a brute he is!" cried Mrs. Fox, clasping her hands. "What is to be done? It's 2 days' post to Dunmere, at least. The letter will never reach him in time if I don't get it off to-night." "Why do you not write the letter here, then, madame?" said Mademoiselle Ixe. The suggestion was accepted with delight, and while Perry was dispatched to explain the delay to Mr. Cosmo Fox, and, if possible, soothe his impatience, Mademoiselle Ixe and Evelyn hurried off to find writing materials. Mr. Merrington looked on in moody silence. Mrs. Merrington's brain was in a whirl. Their silence was not very conspicuous, as Mrs. Fox afforded them no opportunity of speaking. She wrote her letter, standing at the hall table, and talking incessantly all the time. "Now, what shall I say to him? There isn't time for any ceremony. I shall simply say if he doesn't come on Monday, I shall never speak to him again. Perry, you poor dear old thing, don't let Cosmo drive off. He's capable of anything. I say, what a scrawl! There, a blot! It's all Cosmo's fault. Evelyn, if you marry a husband with a taste for punctuality, crush it at once. How many R's are there in hurried? That's right. An envelope, please. Oh, heavens, how does one spell his name? Perry, run and ask Cosmo how the Count spells his name. Evelyn, you will stamp this letter for me. Are you sure that it is right, Perry? What gibberish! Now, Dunmere Castle, Dunfield. What county is Dunfield in? Frithshire, did you say, mademoiselle? Frithshire? How clever of you to know. Let me see, do I put M.B. or N.B. for Scotland? There, Evelyn, for heaven's sake take care that letter goes. Good-bye, Mrs. Merrington, so jolly of you to give a dance. Good-bye, Evelyn, don't forget to write to Hawkins' men. Good-bye, mademoiselle. Cosmo, you ought to be ashamed of yourself. I haven't had time to say half I wanted to say. Good-bye, Mr. Merrington, you and I must have a dance on Tuesday. A square dance, I mean. I am not quite sure of your step, and besides—" The remainder of the sentence was drowned in the noise of wheels and hoofs upon the gravel, as the coach drove swiftly away. Mrs. Fox was really gone, and the stillness she left behind was solemnly impressive. The servants proceeded to rearrange the hall. Evelyn and Mademoiselle Ixe went off towards their own wing, and Mr. and Mrs. Merrington retired to the drawing-room to decide which of the two was responsible for the impending entertainment. When Evelyn joined them about 20 minutes later, this tendency to reproach each other had given way to unanimous condemnation of Mrs. Fox. Mrs. Merrington, gratified by this unusual instance of right judgment on the part of her husband, in whose eyes Mrs. Fox and her doings were usually perfection, was disposed to take a more cheerful view of the prospect. "After all, I dare say it won't be so much trouble or expense. I am afraid Mrs. Barnes will be displeased at our having it in Lent, but really one cannot satisfy everybody, and I do not quite approve of all this fuss about times and seasons. I shall not have much of a supper. They cannot expect it at such short notice." "Supper, indeed!" said Mr. Merrington, warming himself on the rug, and looking half amused, half angry. "I wonder Mrs. Fox didn't order the supper when she was about it. I shouldn't give them any supper." "Oh, Daddy," said Evelyn, nestling up to him and rubbing her curly head against his shoulder in a kitten-like caress, "you know nobody would be more disappointed than yourself when supper time came." "Do I?" looking tenderly down into the laughing face. "Well, perhaps I had better eat when I have the chance, as the day after I shall probably lunch at Carchester Jail." "Oh, papa, as if a little dance like that could ruin you." "I'm nearly ruined already. It's the last straw. You little rascal, all you care for is the dance. I dare say, after all, it was you who started the idea. Confess." "No, indeed, Daddy." "Who did, then?" Mr. Merrington hardly expected and did not wait for his answer. He pinched his daughter's soft little ear threateningly and departed, leaving Evelyn to follow a curious train of thought suggested by his question. If any one did start the idea, was her conclusion, it was Mademoiselle Ixe. Poor Mademoiselle Ixe, as if she could have any interest in having a ball. I don't think dancing is much in her line, but I'm very much obliged to her all the same." These reflections were interrupted by Mrs. Merrington, who now looked up from her writing table. "Evelyn, my darling, you will ruin your complexion and your eyes too if you sit staring into the fire like that. I wish, dear, you would go and make sure that I have put Downshire on my letter to Hawkins, or those stupid post office people will send it up to Carchester in Hampshire. Is it in the bag, mamma?" "Yes, I put it in quite half an hour ago, and I cannot remember whether I put Downshire on it or not. Make haste, my love. The postman will be here directly." Evelyn obeyed, humming Mademoiselle Ixe's waltz, and crossed the hall, dancing to its music. The only lamp as yet lighted threw a small sphere of brightness over the oak table on which it stood. There lay the post-bag, still unlocked. It was very full, and Evelyn at first could not find what she wanted. Finally, still singing, she emptied the contents of the bag upon the table, distinguished the letter to Hawkins, made sure that it was accurately and fully addressed, and then bundled all the letters back again. In doing so her eye caught sight of something which made her stop singing and hastily snatch up one of the envelopes. It was the one which, not an hour since, she had watched Mrs. Cosmo Fox fasten down and address. In the meantime the direction had been altered. The words "Dunmere Castle, Frithshire, N.B." had been erased, and "Claridge's Hotel, London," substituted in Mademoiselle Ixe's small, foreign, and unmistakable handwriting. Chapter 3. Chapter 4 of Mademoiselle Ixe by Lanoe Falconer. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The rain, which had been threatening for some days, finally descended upon Sunday, and by pouring steadily from morn till eve, completed the gloomy character of that sacred day, as observed under Mrs. Merrington's roof. Not only, according to her system, was attendance at 2 public and 2 private services rigorously enforced, but secular music and literature were rigidly tabooed, and conversation on what was called worldly matters generally discouraged. The effect of all this was highly depressing, on no one more than Mrs. Merrington herself. She felt in extremely low spirits as she sat this special Sunday about 4 o'clock, alone, as she was apt to be on Sunday afternoons, in the big drawing-room. A Low Church sermon lay upon her lap, while the rain lashed the window-pane. The moment was favourable for melancholy reflections, and her mind reverted to Mrs. Barnes' insinuations. She began to consider Mademoiselle Ixe's demeanour upon Sundays. In Mrs. Merrington's presence it had been always irreproachable. The foreign governess was ready to go to church 7 times instead of 2, if so required. She read, or at least held respectfully before her, the Sunday magazines and novels provided for her delectation, and played on the piano only pieces of which the titles, at least, were of a highly devotional order. This was all very well, but how, it now occurred to Mrs. Merrington to wonder, How did Mademoiselle Ixe comport herself in the comparative seclusion of the schoolroom? No rumour of troubles in that quarter of the house had ever reached Mrs. Merrington's ears during the 3 Sundays Mademoiselle Ixe had been in charge, and the children, on Sunday evenings, had been found placid in temper and at least resigned in spirit. Mrs. Merrington, with unwonted acuteness, began to wonder if this almost unprecedented state of things was compatible with the faithful observance of her Sabbath rules. She determined to judge for herself, and at once. She left the drawing-room, crossed the hall, ascended the staircase, passed through the swing door at one end of the railed gallery, and found herself in the children's wing. The ground floor of this wing was occupied by the servants' offices, the third floor by their bedrooms, the intermediate one was exclusively devoted to Evelyn and the children, their governess and their nurse. Of a long row of doors, the schoolroom door was the last, and it was open. Standing outside it, Mrs. Merrington could see only Evelyn lounging in the deep window-seat, but she could imagine the children grouped upon the hearth-rug, for in that direction Mademoiselle Ixe was telling a story. And when he looked out he saw thousands of men and women and children chained to the earth with heavy chains, toiling early and late for the cruel tyrants who oppressed them. Why did they go on working for the cruel tyrants, mademoiselle? They were compelled. If they refused to work, bloodhounds fell upon them and devoured them. Were they very tired, mademoiselle? Oh, very tired. They worked so long, they rested so little. Scarcely had they time to look up at the green trees and the blue sky. Mademoiselle Ixe's voice, a sad one even when she spoke lightly, sounded now as woeful as the autumn wind among dripping boughs. Mrs. Merrington was impressed against her will. And did they never try to break their chains, mademoiselle? Sometimes, and then their tyrants threw them into horrible dungeons deep down in the darkness and the cold. But now listen. When he saw all these poor things, he was very sad, and he asked the messenger who they were, and the messenger said, "These are your fellow countrymen," and then the messenger went away. And after that he was never happy any more in his diamond palace, for he was always thinking of his poor brothers. So one day he took off his golden crown and his purple robe, and dressed himself like one of the poor slaves, and went out to live amongst them, and work amongst them, and suffer with them, and teach them how to escape from their tyrants. Ah, here is Madame." The children forgot the story in their surprise and satisfaction at the sight of their mother, and a place was instantly made for her in the circle round the fire. Mrs. Merrington, as she took it, observed with an embarrassed cough, "I thought I had explained, my dear mademoiselle, that I do not like the children to read or hear anything but sacred stories on Sunday." "I don't like sacred stories," said the little boy, who lay full length upon the rug. "Hush, Freddy," said his mother in a horrified voice. "That is very naughty." "And very ungrateful," added Mademoiselle Ixe, "since I have just been telling you one." "That wasn't a sacred story," cried Freddy, in a tone of contemptuous incredulity. "Pardon me," said his governess, "it was a sacred allegory." "Indeed," said Mrs. Merrington, secretly no less astonished than Freddy. "A sacred allegory," continued Mademoiselle Ixe, "as you no doubt divined, madame, of the history of Moses." "Oh, Moses!" cried Freddy, in the tone of a person who feels he has been duped. "I thought it was a fairy tale. I don't want to hear about Moses." This shameless avowal from the lips of her child gave quite another turn to Mrs. Merrington's preoccupation. She delivered a severe rebuke, and then summoned the children to return with her to the drawing-room. Any change was delightful, and they went cheerfully enough till they encountered in the hall that faithful lover whom neither tempests without nor dullness within could deter from paying his daily visit. Then, finding that he was on his way to the schoolroom, they proceeded with their mother, protesting and whining, and in a very unfavourable frame of mind for the catechism which awaited them. Perry, on the other hand, did not altogether deplore an arrangement which might secure him a tête-à-tête with Evelyn. Not only did he find her alone, but he was received with the gracious words, "Oh, Perry, I am glad to see you." So unwonted a reception deprived him utterly of speech for some minutes, and when he had recovered, Mademoiselle Ixe entered, carrying Winifred in her arms. Winifred, who had a cold and was in a very unhappy humour, brightened up at the sight of Perry, one of her few favourites. She would not leave Mademoiselle Ixe, but, sitting on her lap beside the fire, condescended to be solemnly diverted by the opening and shutting of Perry's watch. Evelyn sat beside him, face to face with Mademoiselle Ixe. It was the opportunity she had been hoping for all day, and she at once seized it. "Perry, have you heard from the Count yet?" "What Count?" "What Count? Why, the Russian Count, of course, who is coming with your people to our dance." "Oh, yes, I know who you mean. Yes, Zephine heard this morning." "This morning? Are you quite sure?" "Yes, she read the letter out to us all at breakfast time." "But do you mean to say that the letter was an answer to the one she wrote here on Friday?" "Yes. He accepted the invitation, and said he'd be here on Monday." "Well, it seems to me very strange that she should get an answer to day to a letter that only started for Scotland on Friday." "He isn't in Scotland. He wrote from London. He's at Claridge's Hotel." "Why, that is more extraordinary still, for the letter, which was addressed to Dunmere, must have been forwarded to him at London." Perry, still holding one end of his chain, while Winifred was struggling to open the watch at the other, reflected for a little, and then said, "It couldn't have been addressed to Dunmere, because it is 2 days' post to Dunmere, and 2 days from Dunmere to London. That makes 4 days, and so, you see, the Count couldn't have received—" "Why, you stupid thing, that is just what I have been explaining to you." Perry was silent, discomfited more by Evelyn's tone than anything else. Mademoiselle Ixe, with her eyes fixed on the child in her lap, seemed lost in thought. But Winifred had played with Perry's watch for more than 5 minutes. Its charm was exhausted. She pushed it away and began to whimper. Mademoiselle Ixe rose and left the room, soothing her. "Winnie looks very seedy," remarked Perry. "Yes, she has a cold." "I suppose you've never seen the Count, Perry?" "Yes, I have once, in London." "What is he like?" "Oh, he looks an awful beast." "Oh, nonsense. He does. I bet you anything you like, if you saw him, you would say just the same." "Fancy my using such language about any one. I dare say I should admire him very much. I am not prejudiced against foreigners like you are. I should like to see him." "Well, you will on Tuesday, at the dance." "Before that, I mean." "Well, so you can. He arrives to morrow by the 11:20 at Carchester. Why not drive over in the afternoon and have tea, and then you can see him, you know." "I should like to very much, with Mademoiselle. She wants to see the castle." "Well, then it's settled. You will come." "Well, I will try, but something always happens to prevent my going to Lingford." "Excuse me," said Mademoiselle Ixe, who had entered the room in time to hear this last speech, "but I think that is a great mistake, to be prepared to be defeated. Even in small things one succeeds by believing in success. I make a point of believing that I shall do what I mean to do, and I generally do it." "Well, Mademoiselle, intend that we shall go to morrow," said Evelyn. "I do," said Mademoiselle Ixe. And then they were summoned by a servant to afternoon tea in the drawing room. On the following morning Evelyn accordingly began, "Mamma, do you think that Mademoiselle and I could go over to Lingford Castle this afternoon?" "To Lingford to day? I don't think, my dear, you had better attempt it to day. You cannot have the close carriage. It has gone to Strides to be mended, and it would be imprudent to drive so far in an open carriage to day." "But, mamma, it is a very fine day, and so sunny." "Ah, yes, the sun is warm, but the wind is in the east." "Darling mamma, no. Papa said at breakfast it was nearly due west." "Ah, well, it is as much the same thing. It is very catch cold weather. It would be a sad pity if you were laid up on the night of the dance, and you would not like to wear a high dress if you were not laid up. You see, Winifred has a bad cold, poor darling, and yet she has not been out for a week." Mrs. Merrington paused, dimly and uncomfortably conscious of a flaw in her own argument. Nobody ever excelled less in the difficult task of inventing reasons, and various feelings prevented her frankly confessing that she did not like Evelyn to be much with Mrs. Fox and her friends. "I think one can hardly be too careful. Spring is such a dangerous season," concluded Mrs. Merrington. "Don't you agree with me, mademoiselle?" Here was an appropriate occasion for Mademoiselle Ixe to display the determination of which she had boasted, whereas she only replied with great deference, "Certainly, Madame is right." Evelyn, thus frustrated on all sides, withdrew in some indignation. At lunch that day, during a pause in the conversation, Mademoiselle Ixe said to Evelyn in a low but perfectly audible voice, "Have you any objection to take your lesson after instead of before afternoon tea to day?" "Certainly not, mademoiselle, if you prefer it." "Because I propose to walk over to Lingford this afternoon, and I fear I should not be back before tea time." "Walk over to Lingford! Have you any idea how far it is?" "About 6 miles, is it not? That is nothing. I'm a very good walker. I wish to find at the chemist's a certain embrocation, which I am sure would greatly relieve the little Winifred." "Where is Mademoiselle Ixe going to walk to?" asked Mrs. Merrington, and then Mademoiselle Ixe's intentions were repeated to her. "Walk to Lingford and back? My dear mademoiselle, you would kill yourself, and it is such a wretched little place when you get there. Very likely you will not find what you want. Let us send some one over to get it." "Alas, madame, with my wretched memory for English names, I cannot remember how it is called." "Then how are you going to get it yourself, mademoiselle?" asked Mr. Merrington. "Oh, I shall recognize it the moment I see it, monsieur. I will make the chemist show me all his embrocations. It is astonishing that I cannot recall to myself that name. An old-fashioned English remedy which Lady Carline herself introduced to me." Upon this everybody present began to mention the name of every embrocation he or she had ever heard of, but no one was able to discover the one of which Mademoiselle Ixe was in search. "In any case," said Mrs. Merrington, "you must not walk, and if you are not afraid of driving on so cold a day, you must have the carriage. It has not been out to day." "No," said Mr. Merrington, with some feeling, "but the horses have. The Chestnuts have been over to Carchester and back this morning to fetch something for your ball." Such was the manner in which Mr. Merrington now alluded to that entertainment. "Upon my word, I believe women think horses are machines, and made of cast iron, too." Mademoiselle Ixe eagerly disclaimed the intention of going to Lingford on anything but her own feet. Nothing was more simple, and it would be a charming walk. "No, I don't want you to walk, mademoiselle," said Mr. Merrington, "and any other day you should have had the wagonette and pair, but the fact is, if I have a conscience about anything, it is about my horses. Of course, the Chestnuts could do twice the distance if necessary, but I see no good in working them to the end of their tether. But what I was going to say was, if you don't mind going in a not very smart 2-wheeled cart we have, Giles could put the bay in and drive you over as soon as you like." "Oh, monsieur, you are too kind, but I cannot think of your having the carriage out for me alone. If any one else had occasion to go, it would be different, but really—" "It is not a carriage at all. It is a shabby little cart. It only holds 2. I don't know whether you'd think it tidy enough to drive to Lingford in." "Oh, but 1,000 times too good, monsieur, I am sure." "Well, we had better ring," said Mr. Merrington, "and send a message to the stables." "Pray do not trouble, monsieur, or disturb the servants. I have to go to the stables to make inquiries concerning a shawl I left in the carriage on Saturday. I will tell the coachman if you will allow me." "Very well. Tell him, please, that he is to take you over to Lingford with the bay in the cart at any hour that best suits you, of course." The luncheon party dispersed. Evelyn withdrew to a favourite nook in the drawing-room bay window, which commanded a view of the Park Road and the gravel sweep before the front door. She curled herself up amongst the cushions in a rather discontented mood. She felt that Mademoiselle Ixe, in the matter of the Lingford expedition, had somewhat basely deserted her. The book she had chosen to beguile her was not very engrossing, and before long her eyes and thoughts had wandered from it, and, gazing dreamily out of the window, she mused upon the problem: what could be Mademoiselle Ixe's connection with the Count? While so engaged she was startled by the sound of wheels, and, to her astonishment, beheld the wagonette and pair drive up to the door. She hurried out to the hall, where Mr. Merrington was already catechising Giles. "What on earth did you bring these round for?" "'Cause I was ordered, sir. Miss Ixe, she guv the order, sir." "She didn't order the wagonette and pair." "Beg your pardon, sir. I understood Miss Ixe to say so." At this instant Mademoiselle Ixe appeared, equipped for her drive, and in good time to defend herself. "Tiens!" she exclaimed innocently, "the big carriage and horses are going, then." "It appears that you ordered them, mademoiselle," said Mr. Merrington. "I? No, indeed, never." "Beg your pardon, miss, but you told me you was to have the wagonette and pair." "Oh, no, it was a mistake. I told you the wagon and the bay." "The wagon," repeated Mr. Merrington. "Wagon, cart, it is all the same in English, is it not?" "Well, not quite, but I see how the mistake arose. Giles, those horses are not fit to go to Lingford after going to Carchester and back this morning." "Lord bless you, yes, sir," said Giles, who, in the first place, had more confidence than Mr. Merrington in the endurance of the beloved chestnuts, and, in the second, was very unwilling to undo his work. "They was nigh so fresh a comin' as they was a goin'." "I shouldn't mind so much," said Mr. Merrington, meditatively, "if you could put them up somewhere for a little." "Could put 'em up at the Star, sir." "No, not on market day." "If the ladies wanted to call at the castle now, we might put 'em up easy enough there for an hour, sir." "Yes, that will do. Mademoiselle, you must call at Lingford Castle, it's only a quarter of a mile out of Lingford, you know, and ask them to let you put up the horses for an hour." "Oh, monsieur, I could not dare, I alone, to take this liberty." "Oh, well, Eve can go with you. She is doing nothing. Eve, run and get your hat and cloak, quick." "But Madame thinks it is too cold for Mademoiselle to drive so far in the open carriage, monsieur." "Too cold? Good Lord! It's not so cold as it was on Wednesday last, when you drove with her mother to Carchester and back. What on earth did you mean, my dear?" Mrs. Merrington, who had just entered the hall, could only offer some incoherent remarks, and secretly wonder whether Mr. Merrington would ever recognize the uselessness of asking her to give explanations in public. Mademoiselle Ixe poured forth the story of the trouble and confusion which had been occasioned by her imperfect knowledge of the English language. "I think you talk English quite wonderfully, considering you have never been in England before," cried Mrs. Merrington. "I never remember hearing you make a mistake before." In the meantime Evelyn was getting ready in hot haste, and in a few minutes they were driving along the road to Lingford, and to Lingford Castle. As they did so, it was impossible for Evelyn not to remember very distinctly their conversation of the previous afternoon, but she had not the courage to make any open allusion to it, so completely innocent and unconscious was the expression of the face before her. "I am afraid," she observed as they clattered up the miniature High Street of Lingford, "that there is little chance of finding what you want at Jones's. He is just out, always, of anything one wants." Mademoiselle Ixe, however, almost immediately discovered and recognized the embrocation she required. "But, mademoiselle," cried Evelyn, "that was one of the very first names we suggested." She did not venture to add that it was a common remedy of which Mrs. Merrington had probably more than one bottle in her medicine chest. "Decidedly, I am more than usually stupid to day," said Mademoiselle Ixe placidly, but the more Evelyn reflected on all that had happened, the more thoroughly convinced she became that Mademoiselle Ixe was anything but stupid. There were two entrances from the high road to the wide and richly wooded park which surrounded Lingford Castle. They went in through the lodge gates nearest to Lingford, and as they drove along the winding road which ascended gradually to the castle, the view widened before them till they could see beyond the brown glades and winter-worn lawns of the park, wave after wave of distant mead, or down, or woodland, in shades of shell-like lilac, and grey and yellow and rose, that melted and changed like the hues of an opal as sunlight or shadow swept above them. "Ah, what a lovely home!" said Mademoiselle Ixe, while her eyes rested meaningly on Evelyn. "The other way, the way we shall go out, is pretty too," said Evelyn, colouring. "I like it better in summer. It goes through woods all the way to the large gates." They found Parry lounging near the front door, evidently on the lookout. "Here you are, after all!" he cried, joyously, as he opened the carriage door. "You may well say 'after all,'" said Evelyn. "It has not been easy. Where is the Count?" "I'm not sure, but the most of them are on the tennis ground." Here indeed they found Mrs. Fox, with several of the friends she had mentioned on the previous Friday, established out of doors as if it were summer. "And it is summer," cried Mrs. Fox, looking very rosy and beautiful in her white tennis dress. "I call it summer when I feel warm out of doors, whatever the time of year may be. We shall have plenty of sitting over the fire when July and August come. Will you play, Evelyn, or Mademoiselle? Please, Parry, bring some more seats and a rug, as Sir George will have it that the ground is damp. Well, Evelyn, how's the dance getting on? You've secured Hawkins, I hope? I'm counting the hours till Tuesday night. Cosmo has taken the Count off to see the farm. The stupid old thing can't play lawn tennis. Yes, I'm coming." Mrs. Cosmo Fox went back to finish her game, and Evelyn and Mademoiselle Ixe were left to chat with Parry and the other spectators. Mademoiselle Ixe listened respectfully to a denunciation of lawn tennis as a romping and unfeminine pastime from the dowager beside her, while Evelyn grumbled at Parry in an undertone for having failed to secure for her the sole object of the expedition, the Count. Afternoon tea was over, and still he did not appear. "I am afraid we must be going," said Evelyn dejectedly. "Do you think the horses have rested enough?" suggested Mademoiselle Ixe. "Would you like to walk through the woods to the lodge?" said Parry, inspired by a wish to defer the parting hour as long as possible, "and the carriage could come on afterwards and pick you up at the lodge." Evelyn hesitated. "I think we had certainly better do as Mr. Lethbridge proposes," said Mademoiselle Ixe. "You have not had a walk to day, my dear Evelyn." So they made their adieux and departed. They had not long plunged into the shade of the woods, now brightened by beams of ruddy gold that from the western sky poured through the leafless branches, when they met Mr. Cosmo Fox, alone. "What have you done with the Count?" said Parry. "Evelyn wants awfully to see the Count." "Happy man," said Mr. Fox, "and your flattering wish is likely to be granted, a little further on, my dear Evelyn. I left him to finish his cigar down by the yew trees, and Parry is going to introduce him to you. I call that almost rashly generous. Has he explained to you, Evelyn, that the Count is a widower and enormously rich?" "He'd need to be rich," observed Parry, as Mr. Fox departed and they moved on, "to induce any one to marry him." "I pay no attention to anything you say about him," said Evelyn. "You are so prejudiced. Is it not silly, Mademoiselle? Why, where is she?" They looked round and saw her some little way behind them, stooping apparently to fasten the lace of her boot. "By the by, Parry," said Evelyn, "I want to warn you to be careful what you say before Mademoiselle Ixe about the Count, because—" "There he is," said Parry. There he was, indeed, coming straight towards them, the central figure in a long perspective of intertwining boughs and sun rays. He was smoking, and he looked thoughtfully downwards as he came, so that he did not see them. Evelyn had just time to catch a glimpse of a very dark and repellent face, in which various types were blended, a face with long Eastern eyes and a protruding animal jaw, when, as if moved by a sudden impulse, the Count, still evidently unconscious of their presence, turned sharply to the left, and went down a side alley. "Well, really, Parry," cried Evelyn angrily, "that is too provoking." "Why, how on earth could I help it?" protested Parry, and Evelyn, turning to reply, was struck dumb by the sight of Mademoiselle Ixe's face close behind them. It was deadly pale, with the dull leaden pallor peculiar to such complexions as hers. "Good heavens, Mademoiselle, are you ill?" cried Evelyn. "Nothing, only a slight pain here in my heart," said Mademoiselle faintly, with her hands clasped below the voluminous folds of her cloak. "Take my arm," said Parry. Mademoiselle Ixe declined, and then, in deference to the repeated entreaties of both, accepted the proffered support. As they went slowly on, Mademoiselle Ixe's quick, eager glance down the turning which the Count had followed did not escape Evelyn's watching eye. "There can be no doubt about it," was the verdict of this experienced little novel reader. "She is in love with the Count." CHAPTER V of Mademoiselle Ixe by Lanoe Falconer. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The discovery which Evelyn had made afforded her very great delight. Romances in fiction were familiar enough to her, but a romance in real life in full play before her, that was indeed an experience as new as it was enchanting. Her chief anxiety was how to know something of the past, that she might the more intelligently follow the present progress of this moving drama, and she would have made an attempt to do so could she have secured an undisturbed interview with the heroine herself. But for this opportunity the time was highly unfavourable. The next day, the day of the dance, was one of wild confusion and scurry. In this neighbourhood it was impossible to offer any form of hospitality to less than the entire visitable population without seriously offending all the others. It was a tiresome state of things, highly discouraging to social enterprise, but such was the feeling, and it made itself so distinctly felt on this occasion, and was so hastily succumbed to by Mrs. Merrington, that by Tuesday the projected dance had assumed the proportions of a ball. A great many people condemned Mrs. Merrington for giving an entertainment in Lent at all, but very few carried their disapprobation so far as to abstain from being present. Mr. and Mrs. Barnes were amongst this consistent number, and Mrs. Barnes, indeed, appended to her answer to Mrs. Merrington's invitation, in a postscript often triumphantly quoted by herself in time to come, her earnest hope that this daring desecration of the sacred season might not draw down upon the house some signal judgment. In spite of this, the sanction of the Church was in a measure secured by the promised appearance of Mr. Golding, whose dislike of dancing had been outweighed by his still greater horror of anything so popish as Lenten observance. With the invitation, the preparations had, of course, correspondingly multiplied, and on Tuesday morning much yet remained to do. To add to Mrs. Merrington's anxieties, Winifred was worse rather than better, and was now confined to bed. Her mother could have been tempted at least to defer the ball, if it had not been for Mademoiselle Ixe, who gave her other pupils a holiday, and established herself by Winifred's cot for the greater part of the day. To Evelyn was committed the task of decorating the hall, and it was lunch time before she and her assistants had draped the railings of both gallery and staircase, and framed every window and doorway with wreaths of vivid green, spangled here and there with balls of crimson, white, and yellow flowers. "I think it is very pretty indeed," said Mrs. Merrington at lunch, "but I wish you had put a wreath round the tapestry picture over the staircase. It seems to want something." "But, mamma, I have not flowers enough, and a plain green wreath would look quite funereal round that faded tapestry." "If daffodils would be suitable," suggested Mademoiselle Ixe, "there are plenty to be found at the Beeches." "Yes, they might do," said Evelyn rather coldly. "The truth is, I don't much care for decorating that horrid picture." "Horrid picture! My dear Evelyn," repeated Mrs. Merrington, "I assure you it is thought very highly of by connoisseurs. Mr. Dacre said he never saw a piece of that period so well preserved." "It is the subject I don't like. I hate Jael." "Why do you hate her?" asked Mademoiselle Ixe. "Because she killed Sisera in such a mean way." "Perhaps it was the only way in which she could kill him." "Why should she kill him at all?" "Because he was the enemy of her people." "You appear to forget, Evelyn," said her mother in a tone of grave displeasure, "that Jael was not an ordinary person." "Fortunately not," observed Mr. Merrington dryly, "as she would not have been a pleasant person to meet in ordinary society." "Perhaps, monsieur, you might have found her very pleasant had you met her in ordinary society," said Mademoiselle Ixe, with a smile. "I do not think it right," said Mrs. Merrington, now seriously displeased, "to talk of Scripture characters as if they were living people like ourselves. And we know that Jael must have been a good woman, for the Bible says she was blessed." In the silence which followed, Freddy, who had been twice checked during the last 3 minutes for attempting to interrupt his elders, was now able to make himself heard. "Mamma, I can get daffodils for Evelyn. There are lots down at the Beeches." The little girls were equally obliging. "For heaven's sake, let them go," said Mr. Merrington, who had been banished from his study to a room just under the schoolroom gallery, "and stay out as late as ever you can." "My dear, how can you say so?" said Mrs. Merrington. "On the contrary, they must be in early, for Freddy seems inclined to have a cold. Yes, my darling, you are. I heard you sneezing this morning. Mademoiselle, I think you had better go with them. I will take care of Winifred this afternoon." "And I will go too," said Evelyn, readily, discerning some chance of seeing Mademoiselle Ixe alone. Accordingly, at about 3 o'clock the expedition started. It was first delayed by a little dispute as to the route which should be followed. Freddy was extremely anxious that they should proceed to the Beeches by going down the Park Road, through the lodge gates, and along the Carchester high road. But as this was by far the longer of the two possible ways, and as Freddy had no better reason to offer for selecting it than his own interest in a ferret being reared for him at the lodge, his proposal was unanimously negatived. They went around to the back of the house, and passed through the shrubberies and the kitchen garden into the park. A little footpath led them across a broad stretch of sward, and after climbing a high fence they found themselves in the wood which, at this side, separated the park from the high road. A narrow path through this wood widened at last into a broad avenue of grand old trees, renowned far and wide for its beauty, and commonly called the Beeches. The mossy ground was still littered with the crisp brown leaves of late autumn, but above them the fresh spring daffodils rose brightly in clusters of shining yellow. The children plunged gleefully into the copse, and gave themselves much needless trouble in struggling through the thicket. Evelyn and Mademoiselle Ixe pursued their task more tranquilly, gathering the flowers which grew thickly on either side till their baskets were filled, and they had reached the spot where the avenue opened on to the high road. Here they sat down on the stumps of a felled tree to wait for the children. It was a still, soft day. The clouds had brooded low and grey since early morning. At evening it would rain. But of this moody sky they could see nothing where they sat, with an impenetrable network of branches and stems above and around them. Just under their fringe was visible the flat white road itself, the russet hedge, and beyond that, rich brown fallow and dun-coloured sward, fading at last into the cloudy blue of far-off woods against the pale horizon. Mademoiselle Ixe, supporting her chin upon her hand, looked thoughtfully towards the road, and Evelyn, observing her, acknowledged to herself that the favourable moment had now arrived. But how to begin? It was Mademoiselle Ixe who spoke first. "This is the road by which I came from Carchester, I think." "Yes, Mademoiselle." "Carchester lies to the right of us, I think." "Yes, Mademoiselle." "And Lingford and Lingford Castle, though on the same road, are situated in exactly the opposite direction, are they not?" "Yes, Mademoiselle." How well you seem to know this country already. You must have what papa calls the bump of locality." "It is a gift which I have cultivated. I have found it very useful." "In what way, mademoiselle?" "Well, I have had to find my way about in strange places at all hours of the night and day, when it would have been dangerous for me to ask my way." It was no longer possible for Evelyn to be startled at anything Mademoiselle Ixe could say, but this remarkable statement offered her an excuse for observing in return, "Surely, mademoiselle, your life has been different from that of most governesses." Mademoiselle Ixe, after a pause, answered, "I have not always been a governess." "Oh!" "At one time I was a sick nurse." "Yes, mademoiselle." "Before that I was a laundress." "Mademoiselle! Impossible!" "Not at all impossible. I did my work very well, too, I assure you." "But, mademoiselle, surely you, who are so well educated and accomplished, could have found an easier way of making money." "I did not want to make money." "Then what could I beg your pardon, mademoiselle." "Do not beg my pardon," said Mademoiselle Ixe, gently stretching out her hand to touch Evelyn's caressingly for a moment. "I am willing to tell you as much of myself and my past as I may. I like you," she went on, using as she spoke French the word which means love as well as like. "You are one of the flowers that I have found between the stones upon the rough pathway of my life. Dear little flower, when we are no longer together, think gently of me." "Dear mademoiselle," cried Evelyn, seized and mastered at once by the old irresistible charm, "why do you say that? I hope we may be together for a long time." "We may hope, but we can never confide in the future," said Mademoiselle Ixe. "But to return to that of which you spoke to me, I lived and worked amongst the miserable, the better to serve them, not to give them alms, understand me well, but counsel. In my country the people lie crushed beneath a tyranny so monstrous that their souls, like their bodies, are but half alive. Who shall inspire them with the breath of life, the desire of freedom, that they may rise and deliver themselves, and take their true place amongst the nations of Europe? Happily there are thousands who now labour to kindle amongst them the sacred fire of national life, thousands who for the people's sake have left father and mother and brother and sister, wealth and pleasure and ease." Had the range of Evelyn's ideas and interests been a little less narrow, had she been in the habit of reading anything besides stories in the magazines or fashionable gossip in the papers, had she been awake to the throes and pangs which now convulse the national life of countries less happy than her own, this speech might have revealed to her the nationality and true character of the woman beside her. But Evelyn cared for none of these things. She classed them all under the name politics, which to her meant anything that was dry, lifeless, and prosaic. Of the wide kingdom of romance she knew as yet but one small domain. She had now prepared herself for a love story. She was waiting impatiently for its development, and it seemed to her that Mademoiselle Ixe had wandered from the real point. She made an attempt to recall her. "But, mademoiselle, tell me about yourself. Since you say I may ask, what were you to begin with?" "I was the child of noble parents, wealthy and in high position." "Ah! Were you happy in your home?" "Yes. My father was severe, but just. My mother, tenderness itself. My sisters, older than I was, spoilt me. We lived in a lovely country home in the bright season, and I studied and read and dreamt the summer away in the woods. We spent the winter in one of the gayest capitals in Europe. My existence was a perpetual fête. I passed from one gay scene to another, balls, theatres, operas. Ah, how ravishing the world seemed to me then! I imagined that was human life. The dream was pleasant while it lasted." "Well, mademoiselle?" "Well, one day I awoke. I heard a voice. 'At last,' thought Evelyn, 'he is coming.' A voice," she continued, rather dreamily, "which gradually drowned all others. And one night I obeyed it. When all were sleeping around me in the house I rose. I clothed myself in the coarse garments of a peasant. I stole from my father's house, never to return. Obedient to this voice, I ceased to live for myself. I embraced poverty and toil, suffering and danger. Some day it will call me to the scaffold, and I shall go, willingly." "And this voice," said Evelyn, timidly, bashfully conscious of speaking like a sentimental book, but at a loss how otherwise to word her question, "this was the voice of love, was it not?" "Of love," repeated Mademoiselle Ixe slowly. "Yes, of love. The last, the supreme love, on whose altar we immolate all others." Her eyes, turned towards the meeting line of earth and heaven, dilated and kindled. Her lips parted in a rapturous smile, and so irradiated was the whole face that Evelyn, watching and marvelling, wondered if this could be the same woman she and others had called common-looking. It was indeed the same, transfigured as even amidst the darkest errors of faith and of practice men may be transfigured by the glow of self-forgetful passion. But the little mole beside her, still misunderstanding, still burrowing after her love story, made a second and less fortunate venture. "Was it the voice of the Count, mademoiselle?" The effect of her own words bewildered Evelyn. She hardly recognized the cold, set face that turned slowly towards her. "Of whom are you speaking?" "I beg your pardon," stammered Evelyn, in great confusion. "I thought perhaps as you seemed interested in the Count, Mrs. Fox's friend, I mean, at least you knew something about him. I am sorry if I have said anything to displease you, mademoiselle." "I am not displeased with you, dear," said Mademoiselle Ixe, gently. She saw the girl was frightened, and smiled reassuringly. But the smile, kind as it was, did not soften the look of stern determination her features had assumed. For a few minutes she remained silent, looking thoughtfully before her, like one who had fallen into a reverie, and that not a happy one. The silence was broken by the voices of the children re-emerging from the depths of the wood. Mademoiselle Ixe roused herself at the sound, and, looking Evelyn full in the face, said in a business-like tone, "You startled me just now, because my thoughts were so far away from that of which you spoke. You have divined aright. I am interested in the Count, but my interest is not a personal one. I am charged with a message for him from others. I seek an opportunity to deliver it." "Perhaps you may have an opportunity to night," said Evelyn, much relieved to find the little cloud was so quickly dispersed. "I hope so." "I should like to hear you give it." "You shall." Then the children appeared, laden with daffodils, and wrangling loudly over a basket which had been upset by Freddy, unintentionally, he declared, designedly, said the others. The dispute broke out afresh several times on the way home, and was only forgotten when the business of tying the daffodils into bunches absorbed their fingers and their energies. In the hall they found Parry, all ready, as Evelyn hospitably remarked. He had driven over early in his dog-cart, as he explained, in order to be useful. He was taken at his word, and thanks to his exertions the gigantic wreath was fastened round the tapestry in good time. Then Evelyn was free to devote herself to the study of her own adorning, and she went upstairs to inspect the contents of a certain wooden box which had arrived that morning from London. Her thoughts had been pretty equally divided all day hitherto between the approaching dance and Mademoiselle Ixe's love story, but the latter was swept entirely from her mind by the sight of her first real evening dress, as she herself called it. It lay outspread upon the bed by Susan's reverent hands, and shimmered through the dusk like a frosted snowdrift. To a little girl who had never worn anything finer than a home-made muslin, it was an entrancing sight. Still more so when it invested the slender form for which it had been made. As then it was discovered that not only the gown, but the wearer looked lovely. Such, at least, was the pleasant assurance of the tall mirror as Evelyn gave one swift, questioning glance into it before leaving her room, in obedience to more than one imperative summons. Evelyn, perhaps, assigned more than its due to the effect of her dress, but her rosebud-like beauty was indeed all the brighter for its setting of filmy and glistering white. The consciousness of looking so fair was a little intoxicating. She felt as if she had been drinking sparkling wine when she passed hurriedly into the gallery of the hall. The familiar home scene, shining with lights and flowers, and already filled below by a gay and chattering crowd, showed like a stage especially prepared for her triumph. A long premonitory and suggestive note from the violin made her young nerves quiver with pleasure. She went downstairs, feeling, and indeed looking, as if she skimmed rather than trod the solid earth. On the last step Parry was waiting for her. "Evelyn," he began beseechingly, "you are going to give me the first waltz, are you not?" But Evelyn, when in high spirits, was especially disposed to torment him. "Don't be tiresome, Parry. I want to see something of other people to night. Why can't you waltz with some girl you don't meet every day?" As she spoke she turned her head inquiringly round, and encountered the gaze of two handsome and admiring eyes. They belonged to Mr. Fox's cousin, Captain Leslie, who had just arrived in Mr. Fox's train. Mr. Fox, who wearied of waiting for his wife, had started with all his guests but one, leaving her to follow with the Count. At this moment stage whispers from above became distinctly audible. The children, whose share in the festivity was to wear their best clothes and look on at the dancing from the gallery, were piteously entreating the tender-hearted Parry to bring them some ices. On this errand of mercy he accordingly departed, and returned to find Evelyn dancing with the owner of the admiring eyes. Parry danced at Mrs. Merrington's request with one of the Miss Harolds, who spoke of him afterwards as a young man who seemed to grow duller with years. After that he found himself compelled to conduct a matron of some local importance through a square dance, and then he was free to attack Evelyn again. But Evelyn was in a more uncompromising mood than ever. Captain Leslie was quite the most fascinating man this not very experienced young lady had met. He talked as well as he danced, seasoning his conversation with witty anecdotes and descriptions, and skilfully conveying, without direct compliment, his deep appreciation of his charming partner. Evelyn was by no means disposed to exchange him for Parry, so that unfortunate young man was again dismissed on some pretext which looked as flimsy as it was. Mrs. Cosmo Fox was the last to arrive, accompanied by the Count, who, beside her, looked not unlike a satyr, attendant on a goddess. "Late! I wasn't the least late, only Cosmo was in his usual frantic hurry to be off. In London, I assure you, Mrs. Merrington, if it was not for me we should arrive everywhere before they had lit the candles. But how prettily you have done the hall up! Well done, Evelyn! Dear Mrs. Merrington, what has Mrs. Harold got on her head? I never saw anything so wonderful. And why does Miss Duncombe, with her complexion and at her time of life, wear white? Who on earth is that man in the corner frowning? The new clergyman at Barton. I'm glad Barton is not our parish. But we are losing this divine waltz, Count." And meeting Lady Duncombe's eye, she added hastily, "The Count is engaged to me for all the round dances." And then, as Lady Duncombe herself afterwards described it, she seized the unfortunate man by the arm and led him off without a blush. Lady Duncombe had the more excuse for her censure, as this was the third dance her daughter had looked on at from a side seat. And there was that lazy Mr. Lethbridge lounging in the doorway. Mrs. Merrington herself was struck by this incongruity. "Parry, dear," she said, not too carefully examining his countenance, "would you mind dancing this waltz with Miss Duncombe?" To Parry, smarting under a sense of hourly accumulating wrong, this innocent speech appeared the crowning injury of the evening. "No, Mrs. Merrington," he said savagely. "Excuse me, but I will do nothing of the kind." He turned and strode away, leaving Mrs. Merrington transfigured with amazement. A clue to the mystery was almost immediately supplied by Lady Duncombe. Really, my dear Mrs. Merrington, Evelyn has made quite a conquest. This is the 6th time she has danced, has she not, with that tall friend of Mr. Fox's?" Mrs. Merrington, who had been too busy catering for other people's daughters to pay much attention to her own, heard these words with some dismay. Following the direction of Lady Duncan's not too benevolent gaze, she beheld Evelyn leaning against the wall in a pretty attitude of coquettish nonchalance, while Captain Leslie fanned her assiduously. To put an end to this was Mrs. Merrington's first impulse, and with more than usual readiness she bethought herself of an excuse for so doing. She threaded her way through the dancers to the somewhat conspicuous couple, and after apologizing to Captain Leslie for interrupting his waltz, directed Evelyn to go and fetch Mademoiselle Ixe. She promised to come down for supper, and it is very nearly supper time now. Insist upon her coming, dear, and make her come with you. Winifred is asleep, I know, and Susan is in the next room." "May I take you into supper?" whispered Captain Leslie as Evelyn turned to go. But Evelyn, in whom the spirit of coquetry was now fully alight, only turned on him an arch look, which might mean either no or yes, but which he, of course, determined to interpret as consent. At the foot of the stairs she came face to face with an admirer in a very different temper. "Do you mean to let me take you into supper?" said Parry, fiercely. "Not if you look so cross," said Evelyn, flippantly, as she fled upstairs, leaving him also prepared to maintain that he had been accepted. Evelyn, as the red swing door closed behind her, seemed to have passed from one sphere of existence to another, so still and so dark felt the children's corridor after the brightness, the music, and the cheerful hum of voices in the hall. "Mademoiselle Ixe, Mademoiselle Ixe!" she cried, tapping at her door. "Mamma has sent me to fetch you. Come at once." "Hush!" said Mademoiselle Ixe, opening the door. "You will waken Winifred. I come this instant." She went back to her dressing table to put some finishing touches to her dress, and fasten something into the, as usual, clumsily made bodice of her black evening gown. She gave a hurried glance round, as if to satisfy herself that she had forgotten nothing, extinguished the lights, and then followed Evelyn from the room. "I must give one look at Winifred," she said, as they passed the nursery door, which was ajar, and they both went in. The fire in the grate was flameless, the room was dark, save for the night light, which flickered feebly in one corner. Mademoiselle Ixe carried it to the bedside, and let its light rest for an instant on the sleeping child. She touched tenderly and tentatively the little forehead and hand, and lingered for a space which, to the impatient girl in the doorway, seemed unreasonably long. It is after events that have stamped this on Evelyn's mind. She lives through it all often enough. She stands in the hushed chamber and hears the soft breathing of the child and the far-off wail of the violins in the hall, and she sees Mademoiselle Ixe's changeful face, as she best loves to remember it, with a downward gaze, mild and benignant as that of a Madonna. But at the time itself she noted little of what she saw. She stood outwardly fidgeting, inwardly chafing at the delay, impatient to resume her part in the little comedy downstairs. When they passed through the red door together, the music had ceased, and the people were streaming across the hall to the supper room. Mr. Merrington, with Mrs. Fox on his arm, led the way. Mademoiselle Ixe very slowly descending the stairs, and Evelyn, treading close upon her heels and peeping over her shoulder, beheld Parry and Captain Leslie standing sentinel-wise at the foot of the stairs, both evidently expecting and intending to take her into supper. Suddenly Mrs. Fox's voice rang through the hall. "Count, Count!" she cried, looking over her shoulder. "I have left my fan, my gold fan, in the drawing-room. Please get it." Mademoiselle Ixe stopped abruptly half-way down the stairs. Something apparently had become disarranged in the front of her gown, and must be set aright. Evelyn, waiting behind her, furtively observed with amusement, tempered by dismay, her rival admirers below. Parry, the image of sullen, and Captain Leslie of bland determination. She wished herself well out of the dilemma, and looked up to see why Mademoiselle Ixe still hesitated. "Mademoiselle, can I help you to—" The sentence remained unfinished. Mademoiselle Ixe's head was now so turned that the profile was visible to Evelyn, and the look upon that profile was so unlike anything the girl had ever yet beheld on any human face that it arrested even at that moment her distracted attention. Strangely startled, alarmed even, though without being conscious why, she turned quickly to see on whom or on what this ruthless gaze was bent. The hall was almost empty, for every one but Parry and Captain Leslie had gone in to supper. At this instant the Count appeared in the drawing-room doorway, exactly opposite to where they stood. Mrs. Fox's gold fan was gleaming in his brown hand. Ah, thought Evelyn, with a flash of recognition, the Count, the message! At the same moment a loud crash beside her made her start convulsively, and she saw the Count stagger forwards, throw up his arms wildly, and then fall helplessly to the ground. Chapter 6 of Mademoiselle Ixe by Lanoe Falconer. This recording is in the public domain. As Evelyn tells the story of that memorable night, she dwells with especial emphasis on the, to her, awful pause which followed the report of the pistol; an interval, no doubt exaggerated by her startled senses, during which the people in the supper-room, who had heard what had happened as well as those in the hall who had seen, remained motionless as if paralyzed with surprise. Captain Leslie was the first to recover himself, and, mounting the intervening steps in 2 bounds, he snatched the still smoking pistol from Mademoiselle Ixe's hand. The action vividly impressed upon Evelyn the full import and horror of what had happened, and even as the startled crowd poured into the hall she swayed and would have fallen but for the timely aid of 2 upholding arms. The darkness and the roaring waters that seemed to close above her receded, and she was held back, even on the verge of insensibility, by Parry's voice, speaking as if from a far distance. "Evelyn, Evelyn, don't be frightened. He is not killed." With a long gasping sigh she opened her eyes, lifted her head, and looked round. The first tremor of dismay and terror had given place to a dull numbness which she had often experienced in dreams, and with far less emotion than a well-acted play would have excited in her, she turned her eyes slowly from one feature to another of this extraordinary scene. The Count, whose head drooped helplessly on his breast, carried towards the library by her father and 4 or 5 other men, her mother half fainting on a couch at the opposite side of the hall, surrounded by a cluster of sympathetic women, and everywhere murmuring groups of men with grave looks, and women whose white, terrified faces contrasted weirdly with their gay dresses and sparkling ornaments. A central point of complete repose in all this confusion was afforded by its author, who stood still, or rather leant against the wall, a few steps below that on which Evelyn herself was standing. A little lower still, Captain Leslie kept unobtrusive but attentive watch, prepared to intercept her first attempt to escape. But his vigilance was needless. Mademoiselle Ixe gave not the slightest sign of any such intention. Her arms pendant, her hands clasped loosely together, her head thrown back against the tapestried wall, with steady eyes and melancholy, firm mouth, she might have stood for the statue of Patience awaiting the inevitable. "It is a dream," thought Evelyn. "It must be a dream. I wish I could wake." She shifted her position restlessly, and Parry, prepared to be severely repulsed for his service, timidly withdrew his arm. But to his surprise she caught it quickly in the clasp of both her slender hands, and clung to him till her bright curls almost touched his shoulder. It was Parry's turn to think he was dreaming, and yet he hardly divined the full and flattering significance of that half unconscious, wholly instinctive gesture. Mr. Merrington, followed by Mr. Harold and Mr. Golding, pushed through the crowd below and came hastily up to the group on the staircase, exclaiming as he came, "I can't believe she did! Who saw the pistol fired?" "I did, for one," said Captain Leslie, "and so must Miss Merrington have done, for she was close behind the woman when she fired." Mr. Merrington turned to his daughter and read her unspoken witness in her face. "Good God!" he exclaimed, recoiling and leaning against the banisters. "What is the meaning of it? Is she mad?" "I shouldn't think she was mad," said Mr. Harold, glancing at Mademoiselle Ixe, who was looking sadly and even deprecatingly at Mrs. Merrington. "I should say she belongs to some political society. Fox says he believes the Count has been threatened more than once. Most likely she is a nihilist." "Impossible!" exclaimed Mr. Merrington. "Why, she has been teaching the children for weeks." He paused, and his speech sounded as inconsequent as many another which only gives one link in a long chain of thought. For in the twinkling of an eye he beheld this assassin as he had known her during all these quiet, commonplace days, sitting demurely at table, knitting, beside Mrs. Merrington's armchair, keeping time beside the piano while Evelyn played, wandering over the sunny lawn with the children clamoring joyously at her heels, or later still with Winifred's pale face pillowed on her breast, and one little arm curled trustingly round her neck. "Can such things be?" thought poor Mr. Merrington. And then Mademoiselle Ixe spoke, and the sound of her voice seemed to silence every other in the hall. "Forgive me, monsieur. I have used your protection to attain my end. It was to kill the Count that I came here. I have tracked him for months, I and others. I followed him to England. I became governess to your children that I might meet him. We knew he would not fail to visit Mrs. Fox before he left England. I did not wish to stain your house with his blood. I would have shot him at Lingford Castle yesterday, but he escaped me. In this matter I have been unfortunate." "And why in the devil's name did you wish to kill him?" cried Mr. Merrington. "What harm has he done you?" "Me? None," replied Mademoiselle Ixe scornfully. "What would that signify if he had? He is not my enemy. He is the enemy of my people, and of humanity too. Ah, if you knew all that he has inflicted on innocent men, and even women, you would shudder to eat at the same table with him. He has been tried and judged by his fellow creatures. I would have been his executioner." "This is all very fine," said Mr. Merrington, "but in England, mademoiselle, we call this sort of thing murder, and we hang people for it." Evelyn gave a slight cry, and sank down upon the steps. "In England you are quite right," said Mademoiselle Ixe, composedly. "In England you have a law which protects and avenges you. In our country it is not so. Our law is the will of our tyrants. We must protect, we must avenge ourselves." "Vengeance is mine," interrupted Mr. Golding, holding up his hand. "Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. I will repay." Mademoiselle Ixe turned first on him and then on the picture above her, a swift, keen glance, bright as the flash of a steel blade. "True, monsieur, and sometimes his minister is a woman." "Ah, what is the good of talking to her?" said Mr. Merrington. "The question is, what are we to do with her now?" A consultation followed, of which Evelyn remembers only the conclusion, which was that Mr. Merrington should exercise his right as a magistrate to detain Mademoiselle Ixe for the present, and send as quickly as possible to Carchester for a police inspector. It was decided that her own room would be as safe a prison as any other, and she consented with great readiness to proceed there at once. Something like a sigh of relief rose up from the spectators below, as, escorted by the three gentlemen, she went quietly upstairs and disappeared through the red swing door. She paused once only as she went, to look at Evelyn, who, with her head upon her lap, was now sobbing bitterly. "This poor child," said Mademoiselle Ixe in a tone of the tenderest pity. "Some one should take her to bed." Mr. Merrington gave a distracted glance at his daughter as he passed. "Parry," he said over his shoulder, "like a good fellow, send some one for Susan." "No, no," said Evelyn, putting out her hand to detain Parry as he turned to go. "Not Susan. Oh, help me! I must go with Mademoiselle Ixe. I mean with papa." Feverish excitement had succeeded her previous apathy. Even with Parry's help she could not move nearly as quickly as she evidently longed to do. They arrived, however, just in time to see Mr. Merrington locking the door of Mademoiselle Ixe's room behind her. "I would leave the key in," suggested Mr. Harold. "It will make it more difficult for her to play tricks with the lock." "And nobody would ever have the courage to let her out," said Mr. Merrington. "I wonder now whom I had better send to Carchester. One man is already gone with a cart to fetch the doctor." "Let me go," said Parry. "My little mare is as fresh as paint, and with that light dog cart behind her will get over to Carchester in no time." Mr. Merrington readily accepted the offer, but his thanks were interrupted by a servant who came with a pressing summons from Mr. Cosmo Fox. "I hope that unfortunate fellow is no worse," said Mr. Merrington. "Eva, my dear little girl, shall I send Susan to you? No? Then do, like a dear child, go to bed. There's no need to be in such a fright. She can't get out, and for that matter you can lock your door inside, you know." He kissed her hurriedly, pushed her gently into her room, closed the door, and then returned with his companions to the hall. Here everything and everybody was in wild confusion. Mrs. Merrington had been carried to her room. Mrs. Cosmo Fox, leaving her husband to attend to the Count, had departed with her friends. The remaining guests, anxious to follow her example, were all demanding their carriages at once, whilst the servants, much more concerned with the sensational events of the evening than with anything else, were carrying out their orders with more haste than speed. Parry, to lose no time, went himself to the stable yard, where equal hubbub and even more din accompanied the harnessing of so many horses at once. He found his own groom, and was helping him to put his mare into the shafts, when a footman came tearing across the yard with a note for Mr. Lethbridge. By the light of a stable lamp Parry read in an unsteady scrawl, which at first he hardly recognized: "I must see you before you go, at once, in the schoolroom. I want to see how much you care for me, how much you will do for me. Evelyn." "Drive the mare round to the lime avenue and wait there till I come," said Parry, as he tore off towards the house. The hot-blooded animal was rearing with impatience by the time her master rejoined her. "I shall not want you, Jim," he said to his groom as he sprang into the cart. "You will be more useful here." Meantime, peace and quiet, banished from every other corner of the house, had found refuge in the schoolroom corridor. The children themselves, happily unconscious of all that had happened since they closed their eyes, slept soundly. Susan, the only servant who spent the night on this floor, had gone down to join a select circle in the servants' domain, which discussed vociferously to a late, or rather an early hour, the tragedy of the night. There was no one to see or to hear Evelyn as she unlocked the door and entered Mademoiselle Ixe's bedroom. Mademoiselle Ixe, who was writing at a table opposite the door, looked up as it opened with an expression of surprise, which quickly changed to one of concern. "Dear child," she said, laying down her pen, "how white, how exhausted you look! Why are you still up? You will be seriously ill." "Mademoiselle, I have come to show you how you may escape," said Evelyn, in the forced voice of one who refrains from weeping only by a strong effort. "Parry is now fetching a ladder from the garden. He will bring it to your window here. You can get down by that, can you not, and then find your way to the Beeches across the park, the same way we went this afternoon. Parry will wait for you with the dog-cart at the end of the Beech Avenue, and then take you on with him to Carchester. He will put you down outside the town. You know where the station is? You can get there and be off by an early train to London before the news of what has happened to night can have reached the station people." All this was spoken as quickly as possible. Evelyn paused breathless. "Mr. Lethbridge will do this?" said Mademoiselle Ixe admiringly. "Yes, he has promised." "How that boy loves you!" "But, Mademoiselle, for heaven's sake make haste. Not a moment is to be lost. Everybody is busy downstairs just now. There is no one to see us or to notice us, but in a few minutes it may be quite different. Evelyn hurried to the door and listened. She could hear in the other part of the house the murmur of voices, the rushing hither and thither, the ringing of bells, the opening and shutting of doors, which rendered by contrast even more complete the silence and solitude of the gallery. "It is perfectly safe now," she said, returning to the table. Mademoiselle Ixe did not move. She sat resting her chin upon her hand, and looked pensively before her. Evelyn wrung her hands with irritation. "Mademoiselle, what are you thinking of? Do you not understand? Parry is going to Carchester to bring back the police. Do you not remember what papa says? If you are found here they will take you back to prison, and if the Count dies they will "" Hang me," said Mademoiselle Ixe, finishing the sentence which Evelyn could not. "I do not see how I can escape. I shall be observed, if not on leaving the house or the park, then in the dog cart with Mr. Lethbridge." Evelyn gazed at her in amazement, for these excuses were brought forward in the manner of a person who is hunting for a pretext to avoid an unwelcome duty. A slight noise was heard outside the window. "It is the ladder," said Evelyn. Mademoiselle Ixe did not stir, and a look of moody displeasure gathered over her face. Evelyn rushed to the wardrobe and found a cloak and bonnet. Hurriedly tendering them to Mademoiselle Ixe, she cried passionately, "Please, please, dear Mademoiselle, put them on and go." Then Mademoiselle Ixe seized the girl's slender wrists in a grasp which made her wince with pain, and turned upon her a face literally blazing with fury. "Why do you bid me go?" she cried. "What right have you to drive me back to life, the life of a hunted beast, bleeding and breathless, with the bloodhounds always on his track?" She tossed Evelyn's hands away from her, sprang to her feet, and commenced pacing the room. "I can endure it no longer. After all, my strength is the strength of a woman. It is exhausted. I can endure no more. I have touched the point where fatigue is pain, where struggle is torture. Ah, sacred cause, have I not suffered enough for you? Brothers, miserable and oppressive, have I not fought for you? I have shed for you not my life blood, but my life itself, drop by drop. There is none left in my heart. It is like a stone. Pity speaks there no longer. Let another come and take the place which I have held so long. I ask only my wages. I have earned them. Give me death. Let me die. Oh, let me die." The last words were called out as if wrung from her by intolerable pain. She cast herself upon the ground and wept aloud with the terrible weeping of a strong creature who succumbs at last to a great strain. Evelyn, feeling sick and faint, had tottered to a seat against the wall. She sat there, leaning her head wearily back without attempting by so much as a word to check an outbreak so dangerous at such a time. "What does it matter?" was her feeling. "What does anything matter? Surely this is the shadow of death." And something indeed died in Evelyn that night, never to live again: the confidence of a happy child who accepts as a true reflection of existence her own most favoured and exceptional experience. The vision of sorrow leaves us better or worse, and I have often thought that the Evelyn I have since learned to love and to honour for a sympathy which surmounts all bounds of creed or of country was born when first she felt the presence of that cross which, while it crushes one of us, must overshadow all of us in this great brotherhood of nations. The panting sobs died gradually away, leaving a weird stillness in the dimly lighted chamber. For some time Mademoiselle Ixe lay so motionless that Evelyn wondered dreamily if death had heard and granted her appeal. But presently she stirred, lifted herself up, and rose, or rather dragged herself to her feet laboriously and languidly, like one enfeebled by long sickness or pain. She crossed the room with a slow and almost unsteady step, drank some cold water, and bathed her face and hands. When she turned, she disclosed to Evelyn a face livid indeed, but with no other sign of the storm of feeling which had bathed it in agonized tears. She threw herself at Evelyn's feet with a smile which was at once radiant and sad. "Forgive me. I repulsed you. I spoke roughly to you. It was not I who spoke, it was a demon whom I carry always here," touching her breast, "a demon of selfishness and of cowardice. Sometimes, when my nerves are overstrained, as to night, he breaks his chain, he tears me, he masters me. For the time I am at his mercy, his accursed voice drowns every other. But it is only for a time. The true self is free again. I flinch no longer. Since death does not seek me, since it even rejects me, there must be work still for me to do. I obey you, English, angel-faced child. I return to fulfill my task." Moving quietly but alertly, she seized the papers on the table and thrust them into her breast, found a little purse and put it into her pocket, donned her bonnet and cloak, and then threw open the window. "Let me help you," said Evelyn, going to her assistance. The night was rainy, moonless, starless, steeped in an inky blackness which the eye could not penetrate. The air struck mild and wet against their faces. Far off, in what seemed to Evelyn a different world, resounded shouts and the clatter of wheels on the stony pavement of the stable yard. Nearer, only the wind surging through the laurels with a long, heavy sigh. Mademoiselle Ixe descended the ladder deftly. When her head was on a level with the window sill, she paused and looked up. "Adieu, adieu," she whispered, kissing the small clenched hands which held the ladder firm. For an instant the light from the room was on her upturned eyes and tenderly smiling mouth. Then the face vanished. When the vibration of the foot upon the ladder ceased, it seemed to Evelyn as if Mademoiselle Ixe had been swallowed up and lost in that great sea of outer darkness. What has been hitherto told I have learnt chiefly from Evelyn, but the sequel has been related to me by various others. Parry's mare hardly justified her master's boast, for she does not appear to have reached Carchester till nearly 3 o'clock. The police, however, were more expeditious, and Parry, with an inspector beside him, was able to leave Carchester not much later than 3:15. About 4 miles out of Carchester occurred an accident which has always been a subject of speculation to Mr. Lethbridge's groom and other persons aware that his dog-cart had been recently repaired. A wheel came off. After a little consultation it was arranged that, in order to lose no time, the inspector should walk on to Mr. Merrington's, while Parry, riding the mare as best he could, should go back to Carchester as quickly as possible to get another conveyance. With this it was hoped he might be able to overtake the inspector before he had walked any considerable distance. Fortunately the inspector did not trust too much to this, but walked on at a brisk pace, for, owing to some more complications of which the particulars have escaped me, Parry did not manage to start again from Carchester as early as might have been expected, and did not appear at Mr. Merrington's until after the inspector had arrived there. That was, I believe, about 20 minutes to 6. The doctor had just departed, having given a most favourable report of the patient, who was not nearly so dangerously wounded as had been at first supposed. The inspector, after some delay, was conducted by the housekeeper to Mademoiselle Ixe's room, when the fact of her disappearance was discovered. The only person who might possibly have heard anything of this escape was the inmate of the next room, Miss Merrington, but her father would not allow her to be wakened till her usual hour, on the ground that she had gone to bed thoroughly exhausted by the shock of the previous evening. Nor could the inspector, though he did his best, induce Mr. Merrington to perceive how fatal was this delay to all hope of recapturing the fugitive. Till 8 o'clock the inspector amused himself by breakfasting and examining the servants. Their simple explanation of the matter was that Mademoiselle Ixe herself, with admirable foresight, late in the afternoon, had placed the ladder where it was found. One of the housemaids remembered hearing a curious noise outside Mademoiselle Ixe's room when she, the housemaid, was lighting the fire there, and a little stable boy of Celtic extraction had a dim recollection, which grew more vivid with time, of having seen the foreign governess loitering in the early dusk near the shed where the ladder was usually kept. This unreliable and not very instructive information was all the inspector was destined to receive. For when, at 8 o'clock, Miss Merrington was disturbed, it was discovered that she was in no state to be questioned. Indeed, her condition so alarmed her parents that a messenger was dispatched to hasten the promised return of the doctor. After this nobody had a thought to spare for either Mademoiselle Ixe or the inspector, and he, perceiving the case was hopeless, returned quietly to Carchester. For 3 weeks Evelyn was seriously ill, and when she recovered all mention of Mademoiselle Ixe's name and all allusions to the night of the ball were, by the doctor's directions, carefully avoided in her presence. Long before her convalescence, however, the Count had recovered and departed, never to be persuaded by all Mrs. Cosmo Fox's blandishments to visit Lingford Castle again. The stagnant atmosphere of the neighbourhood was enlivened for months by the catastrophe, and it was the one never failing topic of conversation at all social gatherings, from the groups at the church door to those at the covert side. Unless, indeed, Mr. or Mrs. Merrington happened to be of the company, as the first looked black and the second became hysterical whenever the subject was brought forward. Parry, however, inspired no such reserve, and he was more than once cross-examined on the somewhat complicated story of his journey to Carchester. From this ordeal he emerged as skilfully as might have been foretold, till, by angrily refusing to answer any more questions, he confirmed the suspicions his embarrassment had aroused. It was Mrs. Barnes who gave definite shape and distinct declaration to the vague belief that Parry had been only too tenderly interested in Mademoiselle Ixe's fate. Indeed, this theory in her hands accounted for many puzzling features in the story. "No wonder the poor child was so ill," she would say, shaking her head, "and that the whole family have hushed the affair up as they have. I cannot pity them. I told them how it would be." The excitement subsided after a time, but Mrs. Merrington's ball and its strange conclusion were still talked of at dinner, tea, and tennis parties for 3 years, when a livelier theme was provided by Miss Merrington's marriage to Mr. Lethbridge. About 6 months after her marriage, Evelyn sat late one afternoon in the sitting room which had been so lovingly and lavishly prepared for her especial use. By a brisk walk through the crisp autumn air she had earned the keen enjoyment of warmth and repose. She lay idly back in the deep, softly cushioned chair, watching the wood fire which flickered on the tiled hearth, and flecked with sparkles of light the richly coloured stuffs and the shining surfaces, china, bronze, and gold, which lined every corner of this nest of luxury. A pleasant little perspective opened before her of Parry's return from shooting and afternoon tea. She was too drowsy to think or even to dream. She lay basking in the pleasant consciousness of one of those bright seasons when life is so enjoyable that we are apt to forget that it can be otherwise. She was disturbed, agreeably disturbed, by the afternoon post. There lay upon the salver, strongly contrasting with the stiff monogrammed envelopes around it, a small, flimsy letter which bore the London postmark and was addressed in a minute foreign hand unknown to Evelyn. It was this letter which she decided to open first, and she drew from the cover what is best described as a rag of paper, torn, begrimed, and covered with close writing in brownish red ink, if it were ink at all. At the sight of that writing Evelyn cried and started as if she had seen a ghost, the ghost of one now 3 years dead to her. Too impatient to wait for a lamp, she crouched upon the fender stool, bending till her head was almost level with the bars to catch the glow of the fire upon the small, dim characters of this extraordinary missive. And this is the translation of what she read. A Russian prison, 1880. To us here in the darkness from which we shall soon pass to a still deeper darkness come stray hints and glimpses from the bright living world. And thus I have heard of your marriage. May you be happy! And you will be happy. It is the right of natures like yours. Do you think of me sometimes? I think of you often, and of all the kind, innocent people around you. And then strange hopes come to me for a world in which such lives are possible. The prison walls vanish, and I see the great elms and the flat meadows and the thatched cottages all sleeping in the English sunlight, and I hear the voices of the English children singing, "He hath brought light to them that sit in darkness and in the shadow of death," and I dream that there is a God who smiles at least upon England, and that perhaps some day He will remember us too. End of Chapter 6. End of Mademoiselle Ixe.